commemorate the 35th anniversary of the Edsa People Power Revolution. The significance of Edsa 86 cannot be understated, for it ushered in a new wave of democratization processes that would end authoritarian regimes around the world, as it offered a different path from the traditional revolutionary models for social change. Sadly, however, for the youth generations decades after EDSA 86, the significance of people power has been downplayed, trivialized, and worse, subjected to the vile machinations of historical revisionism. This webinar hopes to not only push back from these attempts at deception, but at the same time to produce and provide us with the opportunity to reassess and reintroduce that historical moment to a new generation of Filipinos. On behalf of the Department of History of the Ateneo de Manila University, the Ateneo Martial Law Museum, and our colleagues and collaborators from our partner Jesuit universities from the different parts of the Philippines, I would like to formally welcome everyone to EDSA at 35, Memories, Legacies, and Uncertainties. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Losada. We now proceed for a brief message from the Vice President of the Republic of the Philippines, Her Excellency Maria Leonor G. Robredo.
My warmest greetings to all the students, teachers, and administrators from across the Ateneo de Davao, Ateneo de Naga, Ateneo de Zamboanga, and Ateneo de Manila who are joining us as we relive the memories, examine the legacies, and contemplate the uncertainties we face as we commemorate the 35th anniversary of the EDSA revolution. Today, COVID-19 remains front and center as the world's greatest challenge. And as we struggle to deal with the disruptions caused by the pandemic, it becomes more challenging not just to plan the future, but to look back and examine our national memory for the lessons that it holds. And yet here we are, remembering what the EDSA People Power Revolution taught us. The real makers of history are the ordinary people. They are the students and teachers, the young professionals and vendors, the fathers and mothers, the broadest ranks of the masses. They who, in the face of great risk and amid the hardest and most repressive circumstances, dared to dream of a more just and equal society for ordinary Filipinos. I know because I was there. I remember our classes were still ongoing, but our teachers knew that we were facing life-changing lessons that could not be learned inside our classrooms. We were encouraged to take part in the rallies in EDSA and were assured that our grades would not suffer because of it. There, we joined millions of Filipinos who gathered to restore our freedoms. There, young people like you braved the front lines to push back and end years of abuse. And we succeeded, because the values and ideals that bind us together are stronger than any attempt to pull us apart. Because when we are united, nothing can stand in our way. We saw this power 35 years ago in EDSA, and we are very fortunate at the Office of the Vice President to see it every day in our work to respond to the needs of our fellow Filipinos during this pandemic. It was again ordinary Filipinos who came together, pitched in, and helped out, allowing us to reach more and do more. Whether it's in the donation drives, PPE production, dorms and shuttle services for medical frontliners, app-based community marts, or projects for the recently unemployed, for small entrepreneurs, or out-of-school youth. That is EDSA's greatest lesson. And this is precisely what we need to guide us through the difficulties and uncertainties posed by the pandemic. That the only way through any challenge is together. Today, you are called to lead the charge towards our shared horizon. to lead a people bound not only by the crisis we face, but by our collective resolve to achieve our collective aspirations for a truly better normal. A world that is fairer and kinder, that is more just and humane. And with young Filipinos like you again on the front lines, I have complete faith that we can soon turn this vision into reality. Thank you. Mabuhay kayong lahat.
Thank you, Your Excellency Vice President Robredo, for gracing our event.
Okay. 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 Again, sorry for the technical difficulties we're encountering at this moment. Okay. Thank you, Vice President Robredo, for gracing our event. Now, to formally open our webinar for today, we now introduce the Dean of the School of Social Sciences of the Ateneo de Manila University, Dr. Fernando T. Aldaba. Good morning, Dr. Aldaba.
Thank you, Alvin. I'd like to share my screen. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Edsa at 35 commemoration. Edsa 1986 was indeed memorable. Our generation was shaped one way or another by the struggle against the Marcos dictatorship. Based on the documentation of Amnesty International, Task Force Detainees of the Philippines, and similar human rights monitoring entities, historians believe that the Marcos dictatorship was marked by 3,257 known extrajudicial killings, 35,000 documented tortures, 77 disappearances, and 70,000 incarcerations. The actual figures actually may even be more. At the end of the Marcos authoritarian regime, it really cannot boast of great achievements done for the interest of our people. The country was buried in foreign debt, the economy was contracting, inflation was sky high, and there was increasing urban and rural unrest. The Marcos dictatorship left behind this big pile of problems from which the country could not easily recover. The rebuilding of our democratic institutions from the remains of the dictatorship proved to be a long and tedious process. Sometimes it felt like the political dynasties and economic oligarchies had become more powerful after EDSA. But even more difficult was how social justice for the unemployed, the landless, the homeless, and other marginalized sectors can ever be realized. We have been very slow in reducing the number of our poor, and the inequitable distribution of wealth has persisted for the past years. I hope this 35th year celebration challenges all of us to get past such frustrations in the disappointments over what happened in the following decades. Many have become disillusioned after the initial excitement and hopes for change gradually diminished. The major legacy of EDSA was the restoration of our liberal democracy enshrined in the 1987 Constitution. Aside from ensuring the people's rights to free speech, freedom of assembly, and other important civil rights, it also establishes the limits of executive power and promotes social justice, all of which are still very significant at these times. These are also our instruments against a creeping authoritarianism in our country today. We still enjoy the freedom of the press, although in this current administration, it has been threatened time and again as it criticized the latter's failings and abuse of power. But our press cannot easily be overcome because its freedom was truly hard-earned during EDSA. The stabilization of state power following a political turmoil always seems an insurmountable challenge. That Cory Aquino was able to establish institutional mechanisms of political succession and transferred power peacefully to her elected successor is already a key accomplishment for a government that captured power through a nonviolent revolution. Of course, we need to do more so that these legacies of EDSAs cannot be forgotten. We have to continue to struggle for political, economic, and social reforms to benefit not an elite, but the majority of our people. And finally, from a personal note, EDSA has shown how a people united can peacefully topple an oppressive regime, and I am proud to have participated in this historic process. I can still feel the emotions I had when Marcos fled on February 25, and when people flocked at the Luneta for the Tagumpay ng Bayan rally to celebrate Cory Aquino's victory on February 16 before the actual EDSA revolution from the 22nd to the 25th. Those were indeed exciting times, which I will never forget, and hopefully for you too. Thank you, and I hope you all will learn much from the insights in today's presentations.
Thank you, Dean Aldaba, for your kind words. Now, we would like to ask all our participants in Zoom for a photo op. So we request everyone to open your videos or your video cameras as we take a quick photo of our participants. So for today, we have more than 150 participants. So kindly turn on your cameras while our team takes a historic photo for this historic day. Okay. So we have 7 pages. So, okay, so screen. Okay. Okay. Page 1. Okay. Next. Page 2. Okay. Page 1. Okay. Page 2. Page 3. Okay. Next. Okay.
Okay, okay, we're done for the photo op. I hope that we are all sort of energized for today because we have 3 panels that will simultaneously be held in the 2 different parallel sessions for today. EDSA at 35 is now officially open. This webinar will now proceed to the different panels from our presenters from the different institutions. We now request our participants here on Zoom to proceed to the breakout rooms for the parallel sessions that you have registered beforehand. For our viewers on the different platforms such as Facebook and YouTube, you will be seeing the different sessions, the two different parallel sessions that will be held simultaneously as well. So one panel will be seen in Facebook, while the other panel will be seen on YouTube. Now, so while we hope that everyone will now join into the different panel breakout sessions, we hope that you would proceed to your different breakout sessions today at this moment. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. For those of you who will be listening to panel 1A, as you can see on the screen, personal and social memories of EDSA, you can remain in this particular breakout room. So perhaps we'll just give a minute for people to go to the different breakout rooms, and then we can start with panel A. 1A. All right. So, good morning to everyone. I would like to welcome you to our first panel for EDSA at 35, titled Social and Personal Memories of EDSA. I am Isabel Nazareno, faculty of the Department of History, Ateneo de Manila University, and currently Executive Director of the Ateneo Library of Women's Writings, an archive dedicated to Filipino women, and a special collection of the Rizal Library. So we have 3 speakers for today's panel, and it promises to be very interesting, perhaps a bit emotional, walking down memory lane. Okay. So let me introduce our 3 speakers. Dr. Jose Maria Edito K. Tirol graduated from the Ateneo de Manila University with an AB Interdisciplinary Studies degree and obtained his MA in History from the same institution. He later gained his PhD in Philippine Studies from the University of the Philippines, Diliman, writing his dissertation of Forgetting and Remembering Social Memory Commemoration and the Jewish Refugees in the Philippines during the Second World War. Dr. Tirol is now on his 26th year working for Ateneo, serving as both an assistant professor of the Department of History and since 2017, director of the Office of Admission and Aid. Our second speaker of the panel is Dr. Marita Concepcion Castro Guevara, an associate professor of the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of the School of Humanities, Ateneo de Manila University. She obtained her MA and PhD in sociology from the Ateneo de Manila and from the University of the Philippines, Diliman, respectively, and was a former director of the Institute of Philippine Culture, or IPC, of the School of Social Sciences. In her talk titled Edsa 1986, Sangandaan para sa Akin at Bayan, she chronicles and situates her personal, political, and professional growth from an NGO social development writer to a democratic socialist to a sociologist against the tumultuous decade of the 1980s that witnessed the assassination of Ninoy Aquino, the last years of the Marcos regime, the social movement that led to the 1986 EDSA People Power Revolution, which toppled the Marcos dictatorship, and the restoration of political democracy under President Corazon Cojuangco Aquino. Last but not the least, we have Mr. Rizalino P. Rivera, whose work has focused on the development of people and systems. He has served as consultant to several government or agencies and local government units, such as the Office of the Vice President and BARMM. He was also Undersecretary for Governance and Operations of the Department of Education from 2010 to 2016 under the leadership of Brother Armin Luistro. In October 2019, he was appointed as Vice President for Social Development of the Ateneo de Manila University. So without further ado, let us begin our panel discussion. I turn the floor over now to Dr. Tirol.
Isa, I'm going to switch to screen share. Hold on. Hi. Is it seen, Isa?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, John.
All right. Hi. Hi. Good morning, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk about the highway of history and the forks of memory. What I would like to more specifically discuss is what happened at EDSA and the last 35 years of how it has been remembered in different ways, some for the worse, some for the better, and what should we do precisely about these divergent histories and memories of EDSA. Okay. Let's talk about first what is clear, what are the facts behind EDSA. EDSA was a spontaneous event. It was a takeoff from a failed military coup, leading to a demand for popular support. In other words, it did not come out of nothing, but rather was born out of years of tension and frustration with the Marcos dictatorship. And such when popular support was asked by the Catholic Church and by cause-oriented groups on February 22, 1986, people went to EDSA and also protested in many cities around the Philippines that led to what's eventually known as the People Power Revolution. What was established by EDSA? First and foremost, and again, this is you cannot question the facts here, EDSA is a restoration of democratic institutions. It's a restoration of freedom of the press, restoration of freedom of organization, local and congressional elections, okay? And the framing first of the 1987 Constitution, which emphasizes tremendously limits on executive power, human rights, and social justice, right? So these are irrefutable facts of what EDSA was able to accomplish. However, the problems of EDSA were unsolvable in so many ways. Although there were many early victories, or what appeared to be early victories after EDSA, after February 1986, there were many limits to what could and could not be done, whether it be a year, 2 years, or even within the first and only term of Corazon Aquino. For example, if you look at the table here, notice that the economy, for all intents and purposes, was destroyed in the early 80s, leading up to EDSA. In other words, Cory Aquino inherited an economy that would not pick up until 21 years later or 4 presidents later. It did not help that despite the best efforts of Corazon Aquino and the best intentions, her own political experience hampered much of the decision making, especially when she was surrounded by elements of both the right and the left. In other words, she was torn between many advisors, torn between decision making, okay, and it showed in the ups and downs of her administration. Furthermore, any attempts at economic recovery were hampered by 6 failed coup attempts, especially the worst one in 1989. Further disturbed by the 1990 earthquake in Luzon, and finally 1991 Tutubo eruption, which means again that any headway that EDSA could have given past democratic institutions in terms of social change and economy were hampered in many ways doomed to fail. But at the very least, and perhaps the final legacy of EDSA within the 6 years of Cory Aquino's term was a peaceful transition of power in 1992. So after 21 years of Ferdinand Marcos, Corazon Aquino was able to turn over the presidency and all her powers to Fidel V. Ramos in 1992. That alone is an accomplishment after martial law. Now, why do we talk therefore about the force of memory? Perhaps after 19, in the last 35 years, and especially in the last 11, 12 years, there has been a growing, organized, systematic, and extensive propaganda in social media in terms of Facebook, in terms of fan pages, in terms of, if you want to say, pseudo-historical statements or claims about what quote unquote really happened during martial law, what really happened during EDSA, statements about both Aquino administrations and anything in between, which exaggerates or totally creates lies about what was accomplished by the Marcoses, okay, and downplays, twists, warps, or completely wipes out beyond recognition accomplishments made after EDSA. And this extensive propaganda, you can see it very clearly in cut and paste in the number of trolls active today that try to show that the narrative of EDSA, okay, and the narratives of what has been accomplished since EDSA are not the same as what history has shown. When I teach in the classroom, I make it very clear that there is objective history, that which has happened, and then there is history as narrative. And by definition, when history is told by narrative, whether by individuals or by social institutions like government, like church, like family, the narrative of what happened is not necessarily what actually happened. In fact, it can go from minor deviations or emphasis on this point or the other, or total manipulation in the name of personal interest. And that is what been happening extensively and increasingly in the last 11 years. There were already some lies about EDSA, about accomplishments. For example, when 2 of the Marcos children would say, "We were too young to remember," which is clearly not true. Imelda Marcos in The Kingmaker said, I'm trying to remember the exact words, truth, it was something about perception is real, truth is not. And this is what we're fighting now when we talk again about the forks of memory. So for example, here's another case. When Bongbong Marcos interviewed by Juan Ponce in Real in 2018, the claims they presented were only one person died during martial law, executed during martial law. What does that therefore say about the proof of people who were salvaged, tortured, and killed during martial law? Or the claim that there were no massacres in Mindanao, which is very untrue because there were massacres committed by the military in Mindanao in the 1970s. And then the Jabayda massacre, the one corridor, also claimed during this interview it never happened. And yet again, there's evidence that there is. So it shows again a systematic, extensive attempt to retell history. It is not so much a reconstruction of history, but rather a recreation of history in a different narrative. And that is what we have to work at today. Other towards memory go like this. There are claims that there was no money stolen, which is not true. As you can see here, now the PCG is able to recover much of the money as it's okay. But because the way propaganda works is they can say, wala naman, nabawi. Nothing's been retaken. Again, not true. And the sheer slow grind of justice in terms of convictions, in terms of found guilty. Again, the Marcos and support said there have been no victories. There have been. But the fact that it has taken 35 years and it will take perhaps more, people can therefore say, again, wala naman nangyari, wala namang kasalanan. Slow justice can therefore be equated with that there is no real guilt. And this was compounded when the late dictator was buried as a hero. Statements like that and other actions by institutions can create, can invigorate, can justify false memory, false narrative. Okay? It and finally, EDSA, the members of EDSA, the victors of EDSA, accomplishments of EDSA, have been further hampered by frustrations with traditional politics of the last 35 years. So in 2016, the victory of the Duterte administration shows the power of populism, okay, aided greatly by social media to claim that populism works, traditional politics does not work, and any failures by this current government are not true. Again, it is social media on the one hand saying that the Marcoses actually did a very good job, and this current government is doing a very good job as well. It shows you the battles we have to fight of narrative and of memory. In other words, what did we really gain after EDSA? Perhaps it is particularly tragic when we realize that many of the hopes of EDSA could never have been accomplished in the first place. There were many, because it was such a spectacular event, the first popular revolution that would later inspire many others around the world, people expected too much. So therefore, the, the sheer excitement, the sheer belief that everything will change was therefore equally shown in the amount of frustration and anger because these reforms did not take place. And perhaps up to now, not perhaps, definitely now, we are still waiting. Okay? Kaya nga, the obvious disappointment its aftermath has led to a very unfair historical judgment of the event itself. And perhaps also another irony is this current administration is actually going against the victories of EDSA when it tries to silence critics, silence the media, and to make fun of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, as shown, for example, in the ongoing drug war. What must we do, therefore? We need to talk about our values. We should stop saying we should just be resilient. No, we have to recognize what are the precise problems that have made EDSA on so many levels a failure, or at the very least, an incomplete revolution. Perhaps we should stop talking about accepting what is going on. Pagtiyagaan natin. Diba? Forgive and forget. No, EDSA shows we need to assert and try to do what must be done. We need to be free. We need to empower ourselves. EDSA shows what is empowerment. And we do not mean talk, we do not talk about going back to the streets. We do not talk about going a popular revolution, but rather to have the courage to do what is right and to assert what has been lost, what needs to be regained, and what needs to be maintained. And therefore, to close this short talk, we need to reclaim the narrative. We need to remember our history. Reclaim the narrative. Do not let it be taken away. During a talk I made four years ago at Bantayan ng Bayani, I said, if we do not speak out, if we create a void of silence, someone else will fill it. We need to remember our history, explain our history, claim our history, reclaim the memory, and therefore claim a correct future for all of us. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tirol, for that very sincere sharing and efficient use of our time as well. For those who have just joined the meeting room, this particular meeting room is for uh, panel 1A to 3A. For those of you who want to join panel B, I have posted the link in the chat box. For any questions that you might have directed to our speakers, you may also type this in the chat box, and I'll do my best to review these questions, collect them, and hopefully we have enough time to go through some of these questions. Now, I turn the panel over to our second speaker, Mr. Lino Rivera. Sir, please go ahead.
Okay, share slide, please. Okay, can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I entitled my, good morning, everyone. I entitled my talk Reflection Points on My Journey to EDSA 86 and Beyond. Um, to be honest, I really made this set of slides for students, for college students. I thought the attendees would be college students, but when I saw the audiences attending today, some of whom were my contemporaries, I'll, I'll I'll adjust my presentation. So the objective of my presentation is to present my own journey and the choices I was confronted with, um, as a take-off point for reflection for our own students and even for our more mature members of the community as we face today's challenges. Very quickly, because Joed has very well uh, gone through this. So September 21 was a martial law declaration. Um, Similar to what is happening today, there were very few political personalities, at least as the start of martial law. You know, like the Aquinos, Tañadas, the Joknos, and other ideological groups that continued the fight against the dictatorship. However, due to the Marcoses propaganda, the demonizing of any political opponent, control of media, the narrowing of the democratic space, with the exception of a few political groups, the general population, by and large, seemed content and quiet. Of course, the cause of all this, as Joe had already mentioned, would be human rights violations. Okay, I will not go into the figures anymore, and allegations of stolen wealth. My own journey was something like this. I was in college, 1979 to 83. For most of the time, I would call it a state of bliss. No? Typical college student immersed in studying, in social life, sports, etc. Not necessarily in that order of priorities. But in spite of that, I was still bothered because there has to be something more. I even joined ASIL in search for that something more. I was actually a student at the University of the Philippines, and yet I crossed Katipunan to rejoin ACIL. Eventually, I joined what was then the Ateneo Days with the Lord in July 1982. And it was a turnaround. It was a turning point for me. It gave my life direction and meaning, sense of commitment, which then led me to Sapang Palay in 1982, 1983, joining the Jesuit novices in their apostolate area in Area F and Area G. It was in Sapang Palay that in that young adult life, that I saw poverty and the big demarcation between the rich and the poor. Sorry, there is something wrong with my slides. Okay. That created an internal dissonance, no? A clash of values of the life that I was accustomed to, of an easygoing life. And admittedly, at the time, uso pa disco. Yung mga kaedad ko dito, kayong tatawa-tawa. Uh, versus spending time with the poor and the poverty and the sickness and sometimes even the experience of death, no, due to poverty. And eventually, I made my choices. And it meant abandoning not just a lifestyle, but also letting go of much treasured friends, no, of the former life. In 1984, I became one of the volunteers and later on an organizer at the Workers' College of the Ateneo, which I saw as a personal tipping point as I get more and more exposed to the basic sectors. And later I would join my mentor, Mark Canonigo, in organizing the urban poor and in forming Tambuli, and later on joining Bandila, which were cause-oriented groups opposed to the dictatorship. No? Some reflection points. No? I only am sharing my story so that it be a springboard to reflect on our own stories. No? So what have been the movements in my own life? What are the things in the current environment that disturb me, that seem to draw me to spend more of my time and energies to it? How do I feel about these realities? How do I feel about my life? How do I feel any dissonance within myself or a pull to leave the present behind and to devote more time and effort to respond to something? This set of questions are true for young people as well as for the older generation, especially those who are in my age group. For most of us, we are experiencing what is happening now for the second time in our lives. What does this mean for us? The tipping point for most of the country was August 21, 1983, the assassination of Benigno Aquino, which was followed by a wave of protests from 83 to 86, culminating in the Edsa People Power. One of the key words or buzzwords that were often mentioned in Ateneo de Manila at the time was the word pagtataya, no? Something that has remained instilled in me to this day. No? Pagtataya meaning giving of oneself without any guarantees. Okay, and that is important. Today, I'm asked by our students, how do we ensure that our students are protected against red tagging or even worse? No, while the university has taken and will continue to take measures to help our students and our faculty against red tagging, uh, I always say that there can be no guarantees, and someone who goes into this line of work or to this involvement must do so with eyes wide open. Kailangan magtaya. There are no guarantees. Pero importante rin, bakit ka magtataya? For many Ateneans and Jesuit-influenced groups in the 1980s, what was the driving force? No? One of the main driving forces was the result of this General Congregation 32 of the Society of Jesus. In 1974, the Jesuits gathered together in Rome, which was a big gathering for them. And two of the resulting documents were one, Degree 2, which asked the question, what is it to be a Jesuit? And they answered, it is to know that one is a sinner, yet called to be a companion of Jesus, as Ignatius was. Ignatius who begged the Blessed Virgin to place him with her son, and who then saw the Father himself as Jesus carrying his cross to take his pilgrim into this company. For a lot of young people in my generation, that was a big pull. No? I was one of them. And then another part of the document which asks, what is it to be a companion of Jesus today? And the answer was, it is to engage under the standard of the cross in the crucial struggle of our time, the struggle for faith, and that struggle for justice, which includes. So for a lot of people during that time, faith that does justice, no, is a very important driving force and motivator for us, no, to participate in the struggle for freedom in Philippine society. But what I'd like to point out is that many years later, I again experienced relative stability. I was still teaching part time in Ateneo, in Ateneo Graduate School of Business. I had a stable job, uh, and then my boss died. No, my boss was Cory Aquino, a post presidency, and Noy Noy ran for president. And after he won, I was invited to join government. And the new call was to join the Department of Education as one of its undersecretaries. It didn't stop there. The dilemmas didn't stop there because in DepEd, I got a heart attack. And the choice was whether to continue or not to continue. And eventually, I did continue. Okay? And it went on. No? But again, some reflection points. Is there anything that seems to draw you more to even greater commitment and giving of self, especially at this time? The point I'm making here is the invitation to greater commitment is ongoing. Okay? For some of us in my generation, medyo nakakapagod na. Pero patuloy yung invitation na yun. But where is it coming from? What seems to be motivating us to do so? For the more mature generation, what are the people and events that has led you to this point in your life? Maybe it would be good to recall that. Do you still feel disturbed at this point? What is your own sense of your future direction? It would be good to continue to expose ourselves to what is happening around us, to pay attention to disturbances, to pay attention to God's promptings, and to explore those disturbances, making those initial choices, and then testing the waters, finding a venue or role, or let it find you. And rest assured, there will be signs of confirmation. Two last points that I'd like to share. After Edsa, I became part of the Jesuit ministry called the Mayo Center. And my mentor there and our boss was Father Benny Colpotura, who was then the Jesuit consultant for formation. And he once pointed out that lay spirituality seems to consist of a series of calls and commitments. And each call is not only a call to greater service, but also to greater freedom and spiritual growth. So what I've tried to portray here is a lifelong process. It's ongoing. And again, a reminder, which some of us already know, that you don't have to be perfect to follow and serve God and His people. God meets us where we are. We just have to trust, allow ourselves to be loved, and to be led by this God who loved us first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rivera, for those thought-provoking questions. So just to reiterate some keywords, the ideas of pagtataya, to engage in faith that does justice, and the invitation to a greater commitment which continues to be open. I now turn the panel over to our third speaker, last but not the least, for this panel, Dr. Marichi Guevara.
Okay. First slide.
Okay, sorry. Okay. Hello, magandang hapon. Magandang umaga sa inyo lahat. Isa, can you see me on your screen?
Yes, clear, clear.
All right. So, thank you for the invitation to be part of this very important and historic moment during which we commemorate the 35th anniversary of the EDSA People Power Revolution. The title of my talk is EDSA 1986, Sangandaan para sa bayan at sa akin. Sangandaan in English means crossroad, fork in the road, and this imagery was used by Dr. Joy Tirol himself in his talk. No? And the thesis of my presentation is this. So in my talk, I will be sharing my own recollections, of my involvement and experiences of the 1986 EDSA revolution and the events that transpired before the EDSA revolution and after the EDSA revolution. And my thesis is that in the same way that the EDSA 1986 People Power Revolution was a crossroad in our history as a people, so had EDSA 1986 been a crossroad or a turning point in my professional, personal, and political growth. I am usually very shy to talk about myself in fora, but I am reminded that it would be all right and fitting to do so by Professor Maris Jokno, who was the former chair of the Philippine National Historical Commission and a historian. So in her essay, The Memory as a Means of Empowerment, Professor Jokno says, history is sometimes viewed as a collective memory, a shared experience, yet history draws upon personal memories since all events develop out of personal actions. History is discourse in power. To engage in this debate is to exercise power so that history becomes what we know it to be rather than what the Marcos family or others say it is. I think at heart, this is what the conference is all about, empowering ourselves by defining our historical experience under martial law, and if I may add, also our historical experience of the EDSA 1986 revolution. So in my talk, I will be going through the historical roots of the 1986 revolution. I think there are 10 events that I thought were crucial leading up to the EDSA 1986 revolution. And in so doing, I will be locating myself in these events. And so I will be quickly going over the martial law period and the Marcos dictatorship, the opposition to martial law in the 1970s, the assassination of Benigno Ninoy Aquino on August 21, 1986, the mobilization of the middle class following Ninoy's assassination, and then the roles of the arts, of the alternative press, and of the development of the social teachings of the Catholic Church and also other faith-based groups in creating a consciousness that saw that there was something wrong in Philippine society then. And then you have the RAM that reformed the AFP movement, the fraudulent snap elections of February 7, 1986, and then the EDSA 1986 People Power Revolution from February 22 to 25. Okay, so what I will be doing now is to see the intersections between history and my personal life, my personal biography. So let's begin with the martial law period and the Marcos dictatorship. Presidential Decree 1081 formally proclaimed martial law on September 21, 1972. So on paper, martial law was declared on September 21, 1972. But I think we remember that Marcos officially announced the proclamation of martial law on television on September 23, or 2 days after. So immediately after declaring martial law, what did Marcos do? And so this is like a primer on how to be a dictator, how to get rid of your political opponents. So first, Marcos had his political opponents arrested and jailed. And so this included Ninoy Aquino, Senator Pepe Jokno, Soc Rodrigo, Ramon Mitra, and so many others. And then he shut down the media that were critical of him and had journalists arrested. For example, he had arrested Chino Roses of Manila Times, Henny Lopez of Manila Chronicle, who also was the president of ABS-CBN. And then also Amando Doronila of the Daily Mirror, Jose Burgos of We Forum, Luis Mauricio of Philippine Graphic, Chodoro Doxin Sr. of the Philippine Free Press, and then of course ABS-CBN, which was owned by the Lopez's, Channel 5 and others. So in summary, through the declaration of martial law, I mean, look at these figures, no? Martial law shut down 7 television stations, 60 national daily newspapers, 11 weekly magazines, 66 community newspapers, and 292 radio stations. Where was I during this time? No? So 1972, I was 9 years old. I was in grade 4 at St. Teresa's College when martial law was declared, and then the media were shut down. I wasn't so disturbed by it because on television, cartoons were playing the whole day. So of course, as a kid, no, I mean, I appreciated the cartoons, not knowing the import, no, of the shutting down of different media outfits. And then Marcos also reconvened the Constitutional Convention, which drafted the 1973 Marcos-inspired Constitution. You see, Marcos, under the 1935 Constitution, was allowed only 2 terms. No? So there were supposed to be elections in 1973, but because he wanted to stay on in power, he had to think of a way to stay on in power that was legal. No? So he reconvened the Constitutional Convention, and then the result was a Marcos-inspired Constitution, which allowed him to stay on in power, even to be like a president for life. And then Marcos dismantled the oligarchies like the Lopez's, stripped them off Meralco and ABS-CBN. This I remember, even as a 9-year-old. So Marcos declared a new society, a bagong lipunan. And crucial here were the use of slogans, media, songs, and education. I mean, it's so ingrained in my mind. No? Slogans like, sa ikauunlad ng bayan, disiplina ang kailangan, isang bansa, isang diwa. So these slogans seem to tell the people that we have to all think alike. No? We should not dissent. For the unity, we have to be united for the progress of our country. And then songs. No? I mean, for those of you who grew up in the martial law regime, you will remember songs like the Marcha ng Bagong Lipunan, or even the Bagong Lipunan theme, where there were lines like, magbabagong lahat tungo sa pag-unlad at ating itanghal bagong lipunan, no? Or lines like, bagong lipunan ang dapat malaon nating hinahangad. And then education. I was, as I said, I was in grade 4 at STC Manila when martial law was declared. And I very well remember how my social studies teacher asked us to memorize the promises, the pledges of martial law. So what were the pledges of martial law? This came out in my periodical exams. P for peace and order. Naalala ko pa hanggang ngayon. L for land reform. E for education reform. D, hindi ko alam bakit ganito, pero D is for labor reform. G is for government reorganization. E is for economic reform. S is for social services. So I knew this by heart. This came out in my periodical exams. And then, of course, you would say that this one, the use of slogans, media, songs, and education would be the Santong Dasalan way. No? But if this did not work, Marcos could use Santong Paspasan, and so he strengthened the powers of the military to quell dissent, protests, and oppositions. And the military was a highly dreaded and discredited institution in our society then. The military and the PC, the Philippine Constabulary, which is the precursor of the PNP. So these are the figures. According to Alfred McCoy, he said that during the martial law regime from 1975 to 1985, 70,000 were incarcerated, 35,000 were tortured, 3,257 were killed, of whom 737 disappeared, and 2,520 or 77% were salvaged. And so this was really a period of a dark history, a dark period of our history for all the human rights violations. And then martial law was formally lifted, but on paper only, on January 17, 1981. But even though that happened, martial law still in a way continued because Marcos continued to possess absolute decree-making powers. Um, but there was also opposition to martial law. According to David Werfel, in his book Filipino Politics, Development and Decay, there were three types of opposition to martial law in the 1970s. No? There was the reformist legal opposition, and here we see the role of the Liberal Party, headed by Jerry Rojas, who was the son of President Manuel Rojas and the father of Mar Rojas, and then of course Benigno Aquino, who formed that party Laban. Laban was an acronym for Laban ng Bayan. And then we had the revolutionary opposition, led by the CPP-NPA, the Moro National Liberation Front. The CPP-NPA was established by Jose Maria Sison on December 26, 1968. And then, of course, we had the religious opposition by the Protestant churches. And then you had groups like Christians for National Liberation, or CNL. I would also like to mention the Catholic Church hierarchy, in particular, Jaime Cardinal Sin, who became the Archbishop of Manila in 1974. So compared to his predecessor, Jaime Cardinal Sin was more vocal against the excesses of the Marcos regime, but he moved from critical collaboration in the beginning to withdrawal of support to the Marcos regime in 1981. It was not mentioned by David Werfel, but I would like to acknowledge the role of the burgeoning student activism, the first quarter storm of 1970, and then how the youth organized themselves into organizations like KM, Kabataang Makabayan, SDK, Samahang Demokratiko ng Kabataan, Makibaka, and then in Ateneo we had the Christian Social Democratic Group headed by Ed Garcia, Lakas Diwa. We also had branches of KMSDK in the Ateneo then. The assassination of Ninoy Aquino transpired on August 21, 1983. Where was I then? I remember that I was a senior at the Ateneo de Manila University then. I was fourth year taking up literature in English. And it was a Sunday. I remember it was Sunday at about between 2 to 3 p.m. when I heard the news that Ninoy Aquino was assassinated. And a cold dread came upon me because I was thinking to myself, if someone as important as Ninoy Aquino, who was coming home from a 3-year exile in Boston and who was being perceived as the leader of the opposition, the only viable alternative to Marcos, if he could be assassinated in broad daylight on the tarmac of the Manila International Airport, that leaves ordinary people like us so vulnerable. It was a brazen, flagrant display of violence. Following the assassination of Ninoy Aquino, we saw the mobilization of the middle class. And then there were many rallies that began. The slogan that I remember and which, played over and over again was, "Hindi ka nag-iisa, Ninoy." This was addressed to Ninoy, "You are not alone." And after Ninoy's assassination, you had organized groups, the middle class, the well-heeled of Makati and elsewhere, organizing themselves into groups like, and these had very interesting creative acronyms like JAJA, Justice for Aquino, Justice for All Movement, ATOM, August 21 Movement, Bandila, Bayang nagkakaisa sa diwa't layunin, Bayan, Manindigan with an exclamation point. So this is the imperative mood, and this was Manindigan was composed of the business sector, those who were in Makati usually, Kaakbay, and then you have groups like Mabini and Flag, which provided free legal assistance to those who couldn't afford it. And then women's groups came out, like WOMB. WOMB, this is a very interesting acronym. WOMB was a women's organization, Women for the Ouster of Marcos and Boycott. And then you have Gabriela, the Concerned Women of the Philippines, Aware. So these were some of the groups that organized. And then the rallies began, and I found myself participating in the rallies. I remember here during the assassination of Ninoy Aquino, I was a fourth-year student at the Ateneo, how my teachers discussed the the assassination of Ninoy. I remember the day after Edsa, it was a Monday, I had a class with Dr. Benilda Santos. She was in tears in class as we were discussing the assassination of Ninoy. And so, as I said, no, the EDSA revolution, the assassination of Ninoy started a whole series of rallies. No? And I just want to show you this picture because this was a picture that was familiar to all of us, no, who attended the rallies. So you will see here the pictures of martyrs during the martial law regime, and they were my heroes then. No, we have Makliing Dulag, a Kalinga chieftain, um, who was killed by the military because he opposed the Chico River Dam. You have Bobby de la Paz, Dr. Bobby de la Paz, a doctor to the barrios who served the poor, who was gunned down in Samar because he was suspected of treating communists as patients. Edgar Hobson, one of our own, a bright student, valedictorian of his high school, ME cum laude, who was a student leader then, National Union of Students of the Philippines, but who eventually became radicalized. He joined the CPP, NPA, when he thought that the middle road was not working. I remember when Edgar Hobson was gunned down by the military in 1982. The Ateneo de Manila University, there were presentations to the administration of the Ateneo for Ed Job to be waked in the college chapel. But the university declined, refused. I guess worried as they were about the security implications for the rest of the university, considering that EDJOP joined the CPP. Dr. John Escandor, like Bobby de la Paz, he was a doctor who served the people. He was shot, I think, in Gubat Sorsogon, where he was serving the poor. And of course, Ninoy Aquino. So these were my heroes. During those times, I remember in my bedroom, I hung a poster. My pin-up posters were that of Makliing Dulag, and I had a pin-up poster of Ninoy Aquino. For my next points, I would like to discuss, I would just like to introduce a passage from Jack Goldstone's The Comparative and Historical Study of Revolutions. So Goldstone studied the major revolutions of the West, and he found out that there are some patterns in the way revolutions are conducted. One of the points that Goldstone said was that prior to a great revolution, the bulk of the intellectuals, like journalists, poets, playwrights, essayists, teachers, members of the clergy, lawyers, and trained members of the bureaucracy, ceased to support the regime, writing condemnations and demanding major reforms. And this was so true. No, I mean the rise of the intellectuals, the protest of the intellectuals, in the case of the EDSA revolution. So I would like to mention the role of the arts, the role of the alternative press and of Reggio Veritas, and the role of the Catholic Church and other faith-based groups, and the role of the active nonviolence movement, ANV. So with regard to this, social realism in the Philippines, in the literary arts, film, visual arts, and performing arts. As I said, I was a literature major then in college. And so much of my politicalization took place because of the stuff that I had to read in the classes of Rafael Brion, Benny Santos, Soledad Reyes. So I was exposed to the Agusa de Desierto writers, F. Chunel Jose, the poetry of Eman Lacaba, Pete Lacaba, Dr. Bien Limbera, Mila Aguilar, the fiction of Jose Dalisay, and then film. We had during this time, the 70s and 80s were the second golden age of Philippine cinema, and while I was in college, I was relishing the movies of Lino Broca, like Tinimbang Kawunit Kulang in Siyang, Kapit sa Patalim, and then Mike De Leon, Himala, Batch 81, Kakaba, Ishmael Bernal, who made a film which was really titled Manila by Night, because it showed the seamy side of Manila. But Imelda protested, and she said that to change the title, so Manila by Night became City After Dark, so that the use of Manila was not mentioned there. I loved the films then so much that during this time when I was in college, I wanted to be a scriptwriter after college. My role models then were Ricky Lee, Clodoaldo Del Mundo. No? And then, of course, we have the role of the visual arts, visual artists who were from the Kaisahan Collective. Their names are there. No? And then this was also very pivotal in my formation of the performing arts, the role of theater groups, PETA, no? And then the plays of Malule Viste Jacob, like Juan Tamban, Makliing Dulag. And then I remember PETA staging Oratorio ng Bayan. I saw this at UP, Palma Hall, but Oratorio ng Bayan was also brought to the college cafeteria of the Ateneo. No? It was street theater at its finest. And then protest songs, no? Like the songs of Heber Bartolome, Jess Santiago's song Halina. We were listening to it before the start of this event. Inang Laya of Karina Constantino David and Becky Di Matillo, Joy Ayala at the Bagong Lumad, and of course Apo also. Later on, I became a part of a group that sang protest songs during rallies. So I became a part of MASO, Makabayang Alyansa ng Sining Obrero. And we would sing songs at rallies in Luasang Bonifacio, in Plaza Miranda, and where there were picket lines, strikes, we were there. No?
Hi, Marichi.
Yes.
Sorry. Obviously, we can see that there's so much stories, but unfortunately, we're running out of time.
Yes, I will speed up.
Yes, would be okay to summarize. Yes, thank you.
Okay. So also the alternative press, we had the role of Jose Burgos, Leti Jimenez Magsanok, and Eugenia Apostol, and then Veritas News Magazine. The women journalists then, no, who included the mother of Joed, Lorna Calao Tirol, and then of course the social teachings of the Catholic bishops, the ANV movement, and the ACAPCA movement, no, of Father Jose Blanco, Aksyon para sa Kapayan at Katarungan. And then, of course, the Reformed Armed Forces movement. Not all, as I said, the military was a discredited institution, but there were some members of the military who wanted reform. No? They wanted to restore the AFP's tarnished image, eliminate human rights abuses, professionalize the military, and then fight the NPA more efficiently. So the defection of the RAM, I would just like to know, which included Fidel Ramos and Juan Ponce Enrile, was very pivotal, no? In triggering the EDSA revolution. Of course, we have the snap presidential and vice presidential elections of Feb 1986. We had Aquino and Laurel versus Marcos and Tolentino. And there were 45 days to campaign. I was a writer then at the La Ignatiana Apostolic Center. I would do videos, and I would also translate campaign materials from English and Filipino. But my personal involvement came in the form of the National Movement for Free Elections, NAMFREL. I was in charge of securing the elections in our precinct in Barangay Palanan, Makati City. The 1986 elections were considered unparalleled in the fraudulence of their conduct. This is according to the CPCP pastoral statement. They were vote buying, disenfranchisement of thousands of voters, intimidation, snatching of ballot boxes, tampered election results, violence and murder. And in my precinct, what I experienced was the disenfranchisement of thousands of voters. No, from the election, from the precincts, we proceeded to the Makati City municipio to guard the election ballots, to make sure that the ballots would not be tampered. No? And then finally, we have the EDSA 1986 revolution, which was triggered by the defection of the RAM, including Ramos and Enrile on February 21, 1986. And then Cardinal Sin appealed to the public in broadcast radio to show their support, appeal to the public to show their support and prayers for the rebel soldiers. In response, millions of Filipinos trooped to EDSA. No? My personal observations of the mood and values predominant at the EDSA revolution, the mood was not angry at all. It was happy. It even had a celebratory carnival atmosphere. And then we saw the exemplary courage and love for peace of the protesters. They were able to face tanks and soldiers with bayonets. And then one cannot discount the spiritual character of the EDSA revolution, the presence of the clergy and of religious symbols, prayers, saying the rosary, rituals like masses, a strong sense of solidarity, kindness to strangers, sharing of meal. I remember a woman asked me and my sister if we would like to take a bath in her home and to refresh. Now, she lived in Blue Ridge. So how would you do that in ordinary times? Invite people to take a bath in your house? But that was how it was then. And then around 10 p.m. of Tuesday, it was all over. Marcos fled. No? So we had a 4-day revolution. Um, so EDSA has been a crossroad in our life of a nation because it ended Marcos' misrule and dictatorship, restored political democracy. We had a new constitution in place, restored our media freedoms, released political prisoners, created bodies like PCGG and CHR, and restored a sense of pride in being Filipino. In terms of my life, how has EDSA been a crossroad in my life? It changed my career trajectory from literature to sociology. From being I wanted to be a scriptwriter, I finally decided to be a sociologist, no, and a sociology teacher also. And then it made me sure of my political ideological moorings. I eventually joined a socialist group, the DS group, Pandayan para sa Sosyalistang Pilipinas. So as a postscript to the EDSA revolution, I would say that as a revolution, EDSA 1986 was able to accomplish the first objective of the revolution, which is to create meaningful transformations of the political order. However, EDSA did not achieve the second objective of revolutions, which is to create significant transformations in the social order. No? So structural changes to redistribute wealth and resources. I would like to end my presentation with this quote from Father John Carroll, sociologist, no? In his article, Values, Power, and Transformation. Father Carroll said, this was the challenge he posed. The middle and upper classes who fought for and obtained political freedom stand to lose something in economic reforms if we really wish to move toward a more equitable distribution of wealth. So his question is, and that's the question for us, will the members of the middle and upper classes who risk the very lives for political freedoms be willing to sacrifice their comforts for the sake of social justice? And so with that, I end my presentation. Maraming salamat.
Thank you so much, Marichi. It was a lot, and we can see that the experiences really continue to leave an indelible mark. Perhaps, so if you look at the chat box, there's been quite a lively discussion, comments from the audience coming in. But maybe just to sum it up, I'd like to ask each of our 3 speakers just a one-line answer, parang oral exam. Okay, and this is really derived from maybe one of the provocative questions raised in the chat box. How do we frame the memory of EDSA so that it's not just reduced to a Ninoy versus Marcos thing? Because sometimes that is what it comes across as. Okay, so maybe if all of you can answer in one line, medyo mahirap, or just a few lines. What is the memory and what is EDSA about? What should it be about? Medyo mahirap.
Can I go first? Pamatapos
Yes,
na.
sure. Professor Tirol.
Okay, Mama Rich, my thesis teacher, 4th year. But anyway, I wrote an essay before that, at the end of this, you could explain the lesson of martial law and EDSA in 4 words: never again and never forget. It could go as short as that, because what needs to be thought about 35 years ago is that 35 years later is that to reduce it to a dichotomy between Dilawan and everybody else, or Aquino and Marcos, is to oversimplify the problems that we have. And to oversimplify the problems means to, in turn, oversimplify the solutions. Kasi to say that it is simply a matter of, social equality, social justice, is to deny the fact that the problems we have are not just current problems, that a lot of things we think of our problems are actually symptoms rather than actual problems. So we have to identify where the symptom begin where does the actual quote unquote disease begin, and therefore what is only a palliative, or worse ways only a panacea, and what actually needs to be done on multiple levels to multiple sectors of society and to multiple institutions of society. I think that's what needs to be done. You can't just sit down and say, oh, ganito lang yan. Because you can never say, ganito lang yan. Kasi in fact, what has to be discussed is anong kailangan gawin, kailangan idagdag, para gawin to, ano muna ang kailangan gawin. So we need to say, what are the solutions and what are the problems that will make the solution or solutions even harder to achieve. So for example, when we talk about EDSA, what have prevented us from really maximizing the accomplishments of EDSA? Diba? Kasi to say that EDSA was a spontaneous solve-all is to reduce it to a 4-day event. It's not. So we need to go back and think what has to be carefully, very carefully studied, and therefore studied of what was, what is, and what needs to be done. I think that's where we need to get at, Isa.
Okay, thank you, Joed. So the
You're welcome.
idea that EDSA was not an event, it's not merely a holiday now, but
Yeah.
it's an ongoing process.
Yes.
Okay. Any of our other speakers? Sir Lino?
I what I'd like to I agree with Joed, no, but what I'd like to emphasize, especially in the light of the occurrences in today's environment, is that the struggle is ongoing. As much as perhaps people from my generation or some people from my generation already wish that we can just rest and relax, we cannot. No. And just to connect this to Rene San Andres pointed out that one of the problems is that our grade school curriculum trivializes the downsides of the Marcos dictatorship. No, and it's true. I found that out when I was in DepEd. We tried to change it. Unfortunately, uh, our term ended. Inabutan kami ng term end. We were able to distribute modules, but to integrate changes in the curriculum was something else. No, it's more challenging, and yun. Unfortunately for us, the new administration came in, no, and I really don't know what happened since. In my own private capacity, I've together with other groups, I've had uh, workshops among public school teachers on martial law, especially the Araling Panlipunan teachers, so that they can stick to the true story of martial law and how it continues to affect the nation.
All right. Thank you, Marichi.
How should we see EDSA 86? No? We should not see it like a magic bullet. No? Nawala lang si Marcos, wala na tayong problema. No? Na siyang ugat, no, ng lahat ng ating suliranin. I just want to say that our problems, no, as a people, they are rooted in our history, date back to the colonial times, no, the Spanish and American times. No? So mahirap talaga siyang malutas. No? But even though EDSA was not, for me, it was not a complete revolution. It was not. It was an incomplete revolution because it failed to address the economic, social transformation part. No, it was able to accomplish only the political transformation. And so for me, the challenge for us now is to work at making our society. Is to secure our political gains, no? That's why our freedoms are so important, no? Our media freedoms are very important. At the same time, we all have to be willing to sacrifice so that the needed socioeconomic reforms can take place, no? And that would complete the revolution.
Thank you very much for those last words for our panel. I remember also, maybe just to add, our former university president, Father Ben Nebres, saying that Marcos was a symptom of a larger problem. And sometimes we get fixated on it and we don't see that it comes from a much bigger institutional structural problem that allowed something like that and like him to emerge. And it's a process that we have to continue to grapple and struggle with. And history plays a very important role in how we are aware of this and how we remember it. So with that, I would like to conclude panel 1A. Thank you to all our speakers for giving their time and their valuable experiences, sharing them with us. I now turn the floor over to my colleague, Mr. John Ray Ramos.
Thank you, Isa.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Okay. Hello. Thank you, Dr. Tirol, VP Rivera, and for Dr. Guevara for your sharing of social and even personal memories in your insightful presentations. And of course, thank you, Ms. Nazareno, for your facilitation of our first panel. So before we move to the second panel, let me introduce or let us now see a short message from the president of the Ateneo de Manila University. It's an honor for us to be graced by his presence. Father Robert Yap of the Society of Jesus. Good morning, Father.
I can't show my video. Can somebody allow me to start my video? Sorry. Okay, sorry. Hello, good morning. I'm really sorry. I was ready to join you earlier to give a welcome, except there was miscommunication. Um, there was miscommunication, and okay. Okay. Um, I'm very glad to be part of this special event during today, the EDSA Revolution anniversary. This really brings back memories, and for my brief remarks, I just like to share my own EDSA stories. I was very happy to see that this is the picture that was used for the poster. Um, when the first day of EDSA, the first night, it's really memorable. We had just finished the ordination of here, Father Louis David, who's in the picture here, still very thin. um, we had just finished the ordination of Father Louis David and Sani Barana. And of course, Cardinal Sin was the ordaining prelate, and then he had to leave right away. And later, as the night went on, we had heard his call to come out to EDSA. So, in fact, we were still in Sutan because we had just finished this celebration. And in fact, this is the cross that was used during the ordination ceremony. And so we did. We some scholastics gathered, and uh, we we gathered at Cubao, actually, in Aurora Boulevard in Isitan, and then we walked from there in front of Camp Crame, and we were one of the first groups actually that arrived in Camp Crame, And so this is Father Tony Moreno. We were all scholastics then. She's now president of JCAP, the Conference of Asia Pacific. That's Father Joe Kilong Kilong, who's rector of Loyola House of Studies. This is Father Manny Flores, and that's me. So sort of bring back the memories of EDSA. Of course, we were very scared. Uh, Father Tony Moreno talks about how his knees were trembling as we were walking towards Krame because we did not know what we would expect when we got there. Of course, my other EDSA story is really, I think it was the second night or the third night, and we were barricading EDSA, no, Santolan and Katipunan. We were there, and then later in the early mornings, the crowd had thinned out except for us, very few seminarians and scholastics, and of course many others also. But I still remember that night because we suddenly heard soldiers banging their shields, and then they threw tear gas at us. First time it was tear gassed. So we went down, and so we went back because it really stung. The tear gas really stung. But I can still remember that night. That's so vivid because in front of our eyes, the wind shifted, and the tear gas went back to the people who threw them, the soldiers, and so that was really amazing to see. Uh, Many people talk about miracles and interventions, um, but that is a nice memory to have. And of course, they were able to get through the barricade, but when they entered Camp Aguinaldo, we had heard that they had actually um, they were actually defectors. They were really going to join the ones who had done the revolution and join the camp of General Ramos and Secretary Enrile. Um, so what I really like to say from I do agree with the panelists that the lessons there today, it's good to recall the 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 events of that day and of those 4 days, and to savor them, to remember them, and to inspire us. But the reminder really is that this is ongoing. This is the struggle for freedom, the struggle for democracy, the love of country that motivates all of this. That sacrifice, that courage that was shown by so many people from all walks of life during those 4 days, that struggle really continues. It's not ending. Um, the changes that are needed are not, are really complex, and that spirit of really being vigilant for our freedoms, they will be continually threatened. Vigilant for our democracy, um, and that this love for country and to be willing to really sacrifice for the country, for the common good, really needs to continue, and it's never ending. And I hope that days like this, when we look back and celebrate, that we can continue to rekindle and be inspired and be reminded that we have to be vigilant. Um, Again, thank you for this opportunity to be part of this gathering. And I hope that everyone will have a very thoughtful day, very reflective day, and that we will really be inspired to continue the struggle and continue being vigilant for our freedoms, for our democracy, and for the caring for the common good of our nation. Marami pong salamat. Thank you very much.
Okay. So thank you for that inspiring message, Father Bobby, and thank you as well for sharing your personal experience in witnessing history unfold 35 years ago. So right now we now move to our next panel in our parallel session A. The next panel is entitled Security, Constitutionalism, and Democracy. I now welcome um, yeah. So the next panel is entitled Security, Constitutionalism, and Democracy. I will now turn over okay. Okay. Panel, sorry. Okay. All right. Okay. Right. Okay. So let me now turn over the floor to the facilitator for this next panel. I now welcome Dr. Maynardo Mendoza, Director of the Ateneo Martial Law Museum, who will serve as facilitator. So you have the floor now, sir.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Father Bobby, for the message. And then I'd like to proceed to this panel. Okay. Good morning to everyone. Thank you, Father Bobby, for that inspiring message. Uh, Thank you also to all the audiences and also most especially to the panel. I was not expecting the panel to, at the last minute they gave a not as individual speakers but a panel as a whole. And it is my, I'm very happy that the topic is very, very relevant also to the university. For this session, I can say that familiarity breeds informality. So allow me to be informal at this stage, but also I have worked with all of the panel members. In particular, I was part of the anthology, part one of Down from the Hill, Ateneo de Manila University from 1968, I think, until 1981. Let me introduce some of the panel members. The first one is, of course, the chair is Dr. Benji Tolosa. Professor Tolosa is from the Poli-Sci Department, Political Science Department, and also as the Associate Dean for the core curriculum. We also have as another member of the panel, Professor Randy Tuanyo. He is the chair of the Economics Department. Uh, and then we have two members from the Political Science Department also, Mr. Arjan Aguirre, from whom I inherited the Ateneo Martial Law Museum, and also Mr. Gino Trinidad. And then they have as the last member of the panel is she, Marge Lopa. Marge Lopa was the co-editor of the first book on Down from the Hill. We have about an hour and we have five speakers. So probably let's do something like sharing or parang kwentuhan. Uh, Perhaps what we can do is introduce after introducing the speakers, they're now free how to conduct the session on their own. Perhaps we can start by asking uh, how different. Tell us more about the book, the second chapter, the second part of of Down from the Hill, and then what is the difference between these, or what's the distinction between this and the former, the part one of Down from the Hill? Perhaps Professor Benji can tell us more about this. So please start. I now give the floor to the panel members. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roy. Um, well, as Roy was saying, this is Down from the Hill Part Two, because the first book, Down from the Hill, no, this is the, I don't know if you can see this. No? Well, hindi makita. No? The Ateneo de Manila was from, the discussion of Ateneo de Manila was from 1972 to 1982. No? So this one picks up from that, the Ateneo de Manila and the challenge of democratization. No? Let me just provide an overview, of the presentation, because it's going to be a panel presentation. Now, what I wanted to do is, we'll talk about the significance of EDSA at 35. Of course, previous speakers have talked about it, no? So I won't dwell into that. I'll talk about the martial law revisionism today, and EDSA and the Ateneo de Manila. And then from there, look at the current challenges, from Down from the Hill, 72 to 82, to 1982 to 1992. Now, I think it's important that the previous speakers have said, that as we commemorate the 35th anniversary of the dramatic, decisive, and historic 4 days of the nonviolent people power revolution today, and even though there's a tendency sometimes not to think of EDSA as a 4-day event, EDSA was in fact the culmination of many years of painstaking socio-political education, organizing, and mobilization for democratization, that dates back from the late 1960s, but taking particular shape after the assassination of former Senator Benigno Aquino. So the previous speakers have talked about that. I think this is important, because these formative experiences in active nonviolence as a strategy, principle, and even spirituality led to the internalization among key EDSA participants of what Father Jose Blanco SJ termed alay dangal, or the offering of human dignity. It was a new political translation of bayanihan, inspired by Ninoy's heroic self-sacrifice. Of course, the more immediate causes were the strategic decision to support Cory Aquino's candidacy, the decision to protect the ballot in an organized manner through NAMFREL, the protest of the massive electoral fraud and violence through calculated civil disobedience. But of course, this was very important because the key catalyst was the CBCP's historic post-election statement, which declared Marcos as the Marcos government as having no moral basis, because it had deliberately subverted the people's will in the electoral process. The bishops, who were closely listening to and discerning the situation with the people, advised in solidarity that what was called for was a nonviolent struggle for justice. I think this is very important because even though what the Reform the Armed Forces movement, or RAM and Enrile, had planned and tried to carry out was a military coup, what resulted was a massive popular uprising for democratization. So I think this is very important. This picture is actually from EG's, and you can see some familiar faces here. I think this is Dr. Rafael Brion over here. And those of you from Ateneo de Davao, at the back here is Father Joel Tabora, if the one in the headband. So in the same way that Father Bobby had the picture in the poster, you can see Father Joel Tabora here at the back. Now, I think it's important now to put this in the context of what is happening, because it is with some irony that we commemorate EDSA 35 during the last year of Rodrigo F. Duterte's presidential term. someone who does not identify with EDSA and has even sought to diminish its legacy. President Duterte rode on a populist wave resulting from disaffection and resentment against traditional political families and their politics, particularly the perceived Manila-centric elite. Frustration with persistent poverty and inequality despite economic growth, dissatisfaction with public services, and a sense of insecurity due to crime and violence. Indeed, Dutertismo may have become possible because of the palpable failure of post-EDSA governments to promote far-reaching socio-political transformation despite the restoration of formal democratic institutions. Through his views and actions, Duterte has also served to rehabilitate the image of Marcos and his regime, tending to belittle and denigrate the many sacrifices of martial law victims and activists and the long popular struggle against the Marcos dictatorship. Now, how will the present and future generations of Filipinos view the record of martial law, the long struggle for democratization, and the commitments to human dignity, social justice, and nonviolence, which underpin the EDSA revolution? In the present context, we find echoes from the past of a president justifying authoritarian rule and repression in the name of promoting national security and reform, while often driven also by a narrower political agenda of consolidating power and resources in himself, his family, and cronies. No? It underlines the importance of studying martial law, EDSA, and the struggle for democratization in the Philippines. Amidst the dangers of historical revisionism and a disturbing popular attraction to authoritarianism, there is a need to engage a new generation who did not experience the events of that time. Thus, the impetus for this research project is the continuing challenge of educating students and the youth about the past that makes a difference in the present. But it is also to understand and appreciate the place of the Ateneo de Manila in this history. The Ateneo de Manila, as a premier national university and locus of the educational and social apostolates of the Philippine province of the Society of Jesus, had to meet the challenge of confronting the Marcos regime and of becoming socially and politically involved. In a memorable address shortly after he became dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at the heart of martial law, Father Bienvenido F. Nebres challenged the community: what is the role of an elite school in the service of the people? Later, reflecting on this period as university president, Father Nebres said that the major focus was how to get the youth committed to Christian social and political responsibility in a time of risk. The Ateneo de Manila developed student organizations committed to participating in social and political reform. Now, the book Down from the Hill that Roy was talking about, now edited by Cristina Montiel and Susan Evangelista, covered the years 1972 to 1982. It chronicled the uncertainties, inconsistencies, conflicts, and obstacles that were faced at the personal and institutional levels in response to the challenges of socio-political involvement during martial law. It was a time framed by two moments of political upheaval: 1968 to 1971 of the Philippinization movement and the First Quarter Storm, and 1983 to 86 of the mobilizations after the Aquino assassination, snap presidential election, and the EDSA People Power Uprising. The Down from the Hill Manifesto, published in the Guidon in November of 1968, was a critique of the elite character of the Ateneo de Manila, a challenge to become rooted in the national situation, especially as experienced by the majority of Filipinos, and a call for structural, even revolutionary change. It became a catalyst for the Philippinization movement, which led to visible changes in top administrative personnel, curriculum content and methodology, and the thrust of student activities. This was an important part of the context of Ateneo students' involvement in the youth activism of the late 1960s to the early 1970s. But the deeper meaning of Philippinization lay in the call for solidarity with and service to the poor and oppressed. At the time, it was interpreted by some as a call to leave the university altogether, to live and work directly among the peasantry, industrial workers, and the urban poor. And when martial law was declared in September 1972, bringing about violent repression that forced political dissent and organizing underground, it appeared for many activists that the communist-led armed struggle was the only visible or the only viable alternative for those who opposed the Marcos dictatorship. Indeed, this was the option chosen by a number of prominent Ateneo student leaders, including Edgar Hobson, Manny Yap, Eman Lakaba, and Billy Begg, who paid for their political convictions with their lives. But it was perhaps quite paradoxical that the meaning of Philippinization would also take firm root among Ateneans who chose to remain above ground. In fact, this part of the personal and institutional story of the Ateneo during martial law could be overlooked because it was not dramatic and at least initially not overtly political in character. This was the story of the student groups and university offices that stressed the importance of social organization among the poor and sought to build independent people's organizations to empower them to participate in social transformation. A crucial part of the background was the transformation of the Catholic Church itself after Vatican II and the challenge it presented to Jesuit education as enunciated by then Jesuit Superior General Pedro Arrupe in his seminal speech that the prime objective should be the formation of men and women for others. In 1975, at the height of the martial law regime under Marcos, the Jesuit Philippine province responded to the mandate of the Society's 32nd General Congregation that defined its mission as the service of the faith, of which the promotion of justice is an absolute requirement. It formulated a strategy for its educational apostolate to address the structural problem of poverty and injustice through a two-pronged approach of galvanizing pressure from below by organizing grassroots communities and fostering responsiveness at the top, by orienting students and alumni to address the needs of the poor and forming them to dedicate their lives to service-oriented careers. At the Ateneo de Manila, this strategy at the Ateneo de Manila, this strategy led to the setting up of the Office for Social Concern and Involvement to spearhead social awareness seminars, immersion work camp programs, and student volunteer programs that aim to reorient the Ateneo community to respond to the call for social justice. Moreover, university offices like the Organizing for Rural Development and the Workers' College were also formed to help build and sustain more directly both peasant and industrial labor organizations. These offices later came together under the umbrella of the Center for Community Services. This vision was also found in the work of the Sanggunian ng mga mag-aaral, no, the socially oriented activities. No, among the founders was Father Bobby Yap. And in the core and major curricula, including English, theology, philosophy, and economics courses. Now, the book Down from the Hill ends in 1982. But by the late 1970s and the early 80s, in an increasingly polarized situation, with Marcos on one end and the CPP, NPA, NDF at the other, the Ateneo community faced the challenge of heightened political involvement. Father John Carroll has described the emerging consensus in the Ateneo de Manila at that time as follows. Politically, it demonstrated a growing opposition to Marcos's martial law regime's protracted character, its continuing violation of human rights, and its promotion of a style of development from above, which did not benefit the majority of the population. Ideologically, it was defined by a commitment to self-development and participatory processes among the people, in a search for a more democratic form of social transformation as a reaction to and distinguishable from the communist-led alternatives. Theologically, it saw the church not just as an institution, but also as the people of God. It stressed that while the church's primary mission is spiritual, this commitment cannot be divorced from the promotion of integral human development and from the socio-political implications and challenges of evangelization. Moreover, as Father Carroll notes, from 1977 to 1983, as more groups saw the need to engage social and national issues and increasingly to distance themselves from the Marcos regime, they did so from a perspective that advocated active nonviolence as a principled framework and political strategy of opposition to martial law. In the conclusion to the book Down from the Hill, I pointed out that by the early 1980s, the Ateneo as an institution and members of the Ateneo community who had remained above ground realized that responding to the demands of social justice inevitably meant confronting the Marcos dictatorship. Social formation and involvement had political and ideological implications. So a new generation of Ateneo political activists had begun to emerge and to respond to the national situation in the 1980s. I think it is important to put the moral outrage and political awakening sparked by the Aquino assassination on August 21, 1983 in this context. The brazen murder opened up new space for militant but above ground protests against the Marcos regime. But there was also a real concern about who and what would succeed a weakened and increasingly isolated government. There was growing opposition to Marcos, but it was not clear what would happen in any political transition. Faced with the threat of further polarization between the dictatorship and the possibility of greater repression and corruption under a pro-Marcos successor on one hand, and the communist-led National Democratic Movement on the other, there was the challenge of strengthening the so-called middle forces. It was important to define that position and take the opportunity to develop a political alternative that would be committed to both political democracy and social justice. Furthermore, the manner of social political change was also crucial, and active nonviolence became a key element of the emerging alternative. Ninoy Aquino's courageous homecoming in August 1983, which he himself identified with Gandhian nonviolence, became a catalyst and inspiration. Moreover, when his 1973 letter to fellow political prisoner Soc Rodrigo became public, it revealed that the story of his personal spiritual conversion while in solitary confinement in Nueva Ecija showed that he had become no longer just a traditional politician. No? It was a humbling and life-changing experience which could be interpreted in the light of Christian faith as preparing him for his fateful decision 10 years later, which could now be seen in the deeper sense of a calling. Thus, the assassination came to be seen as a martyrdom, an act of self-giving, a witnessing to mission. For those who saw in Aquino's death a personal summons to respond in like manner, hindi ka nag-iisa became a call to social solidarity and political engagement for democratization. By July 1984, the CBCP itself took a position of active nonviolence in their pastoral letter, Let There Be Life, an active but nonviolent opposition an active nonviolent opposition to injustice, which distanced the church from both the Marcos regime and those on the left who had advocated armed struggle. It was not just a political strategy. It was also grounded in a particular analysis, program, vision, core values, and even spirituality. Individuals and organizations emerging from or linked with the Ateneo of the 1970s and 80s who would join the cause-oriented groups and Parliament of the Streets defined themselves politically in this manner. These individuals and organizations played an important role in shaping and expanding the space for democratization during this period. The efforts at social political organization, formation, and mobilization would culminate in the popular participation in the snap presidential election and the Edsa People Power Revolution of February 1986. The downfall of the Marcos dictatorship and the transition to democracy during 1986 to 1992 presented a new challenge in moving from extra-parliamentary struggle to engaging the formal democratic process by helping build political institutions, including writing a new constitution, formulating and pushing for socially oriented policies, and participating in electoral politics and governance. It was in this context that the Ateneo Center for Social Policy and Public Affairs was created to be an institutional vehicle for this kind of social political engagement. This was also a time when there were continuing threats to the consolidation of political democracy, especially from military coup plotters. Thus, part of the task was how to defend the democratic gains of the Edsa revolution against authoritarianism, while at the same time deepening the newly restored democratic system beyond its formal and elite character. The times called for continuing socio-political formation and organization to define and institutionalize an ideological alternative that would be committed to both participatory democracy and social justice. Now, according to Ed Garcia, a key figure in the Parliament of the Streets both before September 1972 and after August 1983, and later one of the framers of the Constitution, he said the Ateneo played three key roles during the critical period. First, the Ateneo became a sanctuary for contestation where social protests could be articulated. It was a safe space for discussing ideas, for exploring frontiers, to move things forward, to assess alternatives, to analyze and strategize. He says that in the 1980s, providing this space was a brave thing to do. And he says the Jesuits have to reclaim that. Second, the university became a venue for networking across and between sectors because of its convening capacity through the Ateneo academics, professionals, and alumni who were able to bring in different sectors for consultations and conferences, especially the basic sectors who were being organized by the Ateneo Social Development Centers. Third, building on its capacity for networking, the Ateneo hosted initiatives and organized efforts in the following areas: consolidating democracy, including opposing military coup attempts and advocating participatory governance; building peace, promoting social justice, defending human rights, and raising ecological awareness. Initially, it was a time of optimism about the prospects for shifting focus and strategies from extra-constitutional and extra-parliamentary work to engaging governmental institutions within the framework of a new democratic constitution. Within the university, there were efforts at institutionalizing initiatives and learning experiences from the 1970s to the 1980s, like the immersion program, the theory and practice of social development, and development studies more broadly. The Ateneo community faced the question of how to scale up social formation and involvement programs. But by the early 1990s, the limitations of the restored democratic institutions in the post-EDSA context became more apparent, and the complex dilemmas of deepening democracy beyond its formal and elite character became a real challenge. This was happening even as the democratic project itself was under attack from extremist groups internally and under pressure to align with the globally dominant neoliberal political economic consensus. Even the priorities of international partners and funders were changing. By the late 1980s and the early 1990s, the effect was a narrowing of the space for democratization that had been painstakingly created in 1983 to 1986. How was the university itself affected by these changes? Were there shifts in priorities and strategies? One of them is the shift from advocacy politics to development management. No? And then part of the effect also was that there was a focus more on building resources and financing and infrastructure in order to promote growth, sustainability, and competitiveness. No? Father Nebres, reflecting on the limitations of the 1975 Jesuit education policy paper and strategy many years later, pointed out that while it succeeded in creating some pockets of change, it could not grow beyond a certain level. He argues that the strategy, while having some success with what we may call the first stages of human social development, could not move on beyond towards making communities economically independent. In most cases, their economic success remained dependent on the continuation of the initial organizers and project funding. He notes that we failed to see that the stabilization and growth of these efforts depends on the building up of middle-level mediating institutions. Which brings us now to the present project, now looking at 1982 to 1992. The present research project extends the 2005 book and asks What were the external and internal factors that facilitated the Ateneo community's engagement with the national situation during this period? What was the vision, project, and strategy for social change? What did the Ateneo stand for? Were there non-negotiables and core values? What kind of socio-political space did it help create, shape, and provide? What role did it play in the democratic transition? What were the strengths and limitations? Given the continuing challenges of socio-political democratization today in the face of the real threats of authoritarianism, which are echoes of the Marcos period, what are the dimensions that can be renewed and revitalized? What can we learn from the Ateneo of 1982 to 1992? What can it contribute to the challenges of socio-political formation and engagement of the youth today? Gina, you want to share your screen?
Hello? Hello? Yeah. Nasaan na? Okay na. Are we on? Are we on? Sige. Let's move on to the next presentation.
Hello, good morning.
Hello.
Everyone can hear me.
Yes, please. Please continue. Mr. Dr. Antonio, please continue.
Hindi pa po, Doctor, sir. Thank you. Good morning. This presentation presents some responses of the Philippine Jesuits concerning the socio-political issues present in the Philippines from the years 82 to 92, following an earlier discussion of the prior decade in the first volume of Down from the Hill. But first, let me contextualize by giving some preliminary notes on the Catholic Church and or in politics. A fundamental claim that has been that of the Catholic Church as a potent political mobilizing force. Given the values it espouses and the resources and linkages it possesses, the Catholic Church historically has been an important agent of regime legitimation, whether that's democratic or not democratic. However, scholars like Daniel Philpott has also examined how the Catholic Church, with varying success, has been involved in resisting authoritarian regimes, as such playing a crucial role in the efforts for democratic transition. Philpott, in fact, points out that the third wave of democratization, that is, the spate of democratic transitions around the world that started from 1974 in Portugal until the late 1980s, is a Catholic wave. Examining the relationship between Catholicism and democracy leads to two fundamental questions. On the one hand, there is the question as to the reasons why the Catholic Church has been supportive of democracy. Two reasons stand out. First is on how transitions to democracy prove favorable to the interests of the Catholic Church itself. Such interests can include institutional autonomy vis-a-vis the encroachment of the state, and also institutional relevance. Second, and the rather dominant reason, is on how the ideational changes in the Catholic Church, brought about primarily by the Second Vatican Council, which Dr. Tolosa already mentioned, has made the Catholic Church much more supportive of democracy. On the other hand, there is also the question on the role of the Catholic Church plays or should play after the transition. In most cases, the Catholic Church plays a more facilitative role immediately after the transition to democracy, thus contributing to what we call in Pol-Sci democratic consolidation. Although eventually contestations arise, especially concerning specific issues, it can be argued that in general, the Catholic Church remains bound to the democratic norms vis-a-vis society post-transition. Now, zooming in on the Philippine context, such support for democracy on the part of the Catholic Church, especially during those times from 1982 to 1992, was couched in terms of three commitments. First concerned the commitment to human rights, especially the right to life. Arguably, the Philippine Catholic Church's position vis-a-vis the Marcos authoritarian regime, as primarily reflected in the words of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, or the CBCP, turned increasingly critical as the regime proved to be an intense violator of human rights. Second is a commitment to political participation, especially through elections. The CBCP during the period of years spanning 1973 to 1992 was consistent in its call for the people to participate in elections. Arguably, as mentioned also in the other panel, the death knell of the Marcos authoritarian regime was sounded upon the release of the post-election statement on Feb 13, 1986 by the CBCP. Third and last is a commitment to active nonviolence, which arguably reached its peak expression during the EDSA revolution. Now, such general commitments are reflected in the responses of the Jesuits with regard to the socio-political contexts of the years 83 to 92. What proved to be the main concern during the years 83 to 86 was the matter of the best Christian response to the Marcos authoritarian regime. As Father Bienvenido Nebres was provincial superior of the Philippine Jesuits from 83 to 89, mentioned in an interview I had with him, and to quote, "The single concern was how to define a way out of the situation of martial law into democracy and how to do it within the Catholic or Christian parameters," end quote. The Jesuits were primarily involved in the organization and coordination of the middle forces, that is, the groups critical of the alternatives propounded by the right-wing state on the one hand and by the radical left on the other. There were the active nonviolent seminars, of which Father Jose Blanco was a central figure. Jesuit priests and scholastics were also heavily involved in masses and rallies for justice and peace, especially in the wake of the Ninoy Aquino assassination. The Philippine Clipper, the official chronicle of the Philippine Jesuits, also reported on the heavy involvement of Jesuit scholastics during the snap elections and the mobilization at EDSA. I think it is important to note here, and also mentioned by Dr. Tolosa, that the eventual responses were formed by largely also by two reflections from the early 1970s. First was the speech delivered by Father Pedro Arupe in 1973, where he defined the formation of men and women for others as the primary objective of Jesuit education. Second was the 32nd General Congregation of the Jesuits, primarily Decree 4, which defined the Jesuits' mission as the service of faith, of which the promotion of justice is an absolute requirement, quoting from the text of Decree 4. The years 1987 to 1992 posed the challenge of consolidating democracy. In general, the Jesuits were involved in three activities. First concerned elections, especially the plebiscite for the ratification of the 87 Constitution. In one Philippine Clipper report, it was noted that several activities were held in Ateneo de Manila University in preparation for the plebiscite, including distribution of copies of the Constitution and also different fora discussing the salient points of the Constitution. Another report in the Philippine Clipper noted how the Jesuit scholastics were heavily involved in the education and information campaign for the plebiscite, primarily through the Simbang Lingkod ng Bayan. The Jesuits were also involved in activities in support of the democratic regime vis-a-vis the coup d'etat attempts. There was also the apostolate with the military. The Philippine Clipper reported in September 1987, and I quote, "Simbang Lingkod ng Bayan also started its apostolate with the military. Sisters, scholastics, and priests have been going to Camp Aguinaldo for masses, talks, and dialogues. The possibility of servicing other camps nationwide is being studied," end quote. Lastly, the Jesuits in their different capacities and through different organizations got involved in the social reform agenda. As Father Ben Nebres also pointed out in my interview with him, and I quote, "But I would say that the biggest challenge that we wanted to address in the period 87 to 93 was that at the end of the day, the challenge was social reform. How do you really overcome poverty was the problem," end quote. It must be noted that in this work, the Jesuits shifted to a more supportive and facilitative role rather than an upfront one. Such supportive and facilitative role was reflected in, for example, the creation of the Social Development Complex that will be tackled by my co-panelists, and in the close relationship with sectoral organizations. In summary then, what figured as the best Christian response to the dictatorship is a democratic response espousing active nonviolence, political participation, and respect for human rights. Post-transition, the democratic role of the Catholic Church, especially those of the Jesuits, became more supportive and facilitative rather than that of being upfront. Crucial here is a form of companionship afforded most especially by the Jesuit scholastics to sectoral organizations and even students through their organizations. However, despite several changes, the same set of challenges continue to beset Philippine society. Father Nebres mentions that despite being able to stabilize democracy, and I quote, "we really have not succeeded in the social reform. Such continues to be a work in progress." That's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gino, for that presentation. Before we move on to the next, may I just remind the panel that we have only until 11:50 and we still have 3 speakers. I leave it that to you on how to manage time. Okay, so next presenter, who's next? Randy?
Presenting, yeah,
Randy. Oh yeah,
presenting,
Randy, please continue.
I'll try to be brief. I don't know if you can see my presentation. Just increase the size. Okay, thank you very much. I'm presenting parts of the paper that we've written on the social and political involvement of Ateneo studentry, which we have written collectively on looking at the involvement of the university from 1982 to 1992. In the interviews that actually conducted with student leaders in the 1980s, one of the enduring recollections of the university participation in the protest movement leading to the February 1986 revolution was the participation of more than 1,000 students at the Ninoy Aquino Funeral March in September 1, 1983. This has been described as the first major mobilization, political mobilization of the Ateneo studentry in the 1980s, where more than 1,000 in a student population of just less than 3,000 in college participated. This singular event has led to more social political mobilizations by the students, such by September 1984, according to a survey undertaken by the Guidon, 2/3 of all juniors and seniors were attending mass actions, and by many estimates in other papers, 1/3 of the student population participated in the civil disobedience campaign called by Cory Aquino, and also was at Edsa during the 1986 People Power Revolution. In the interviews also that we undertook this chapter, there were several factors that our informants actually cited for their political and social involvement, and some of these were actually discussed by our speakers in the earlier panel. Many of the students in the early 1980s traced their social involvement to their membership in socially oriented organizations such as the Ateneo Student Catholic Action, the Ateneo Cathetical Instruction League, the Ateneo Christian Life Community, which were involved in teaching catechism to children in urban poor communities around the Ateneo. Many of these communities experienced demolitions by the military and the police, which led many of them questioning the direction of national development that then the authoritarian regime undertook. Student leaders participated in immersion and summer work camp activities organized by the OSCI, which was for them the first exposure to the world of poverty and the presence of social injustice happening around the country. Several students were also involved in efforts to organize labor and farmers undertaken by the various units of the Center for Community Services, such as the Workers' College and the Organizing for Rural Development. Many student council leaders also traced their initial awareness of political issues because of the study circle discussions undertaken by the Office of Student Activities and various discussion fora and seminars. There were also organizations involved in focusing on specific sectoral issues, such as those of political trainees, called Lingap Bilanggo, where many students became involved. Social orientation also were provided by different college courses, such as the Theology of Liberation, which has a very strong faith and justice component, and the social and economic analysis frameworks undertaken in courses organized by the Interdisciplinary Studies Program, the Economics and Sociology and Anthropology departments. All of these efforts were supported by various college offices and the external institutions, such as the Tagasa Network of Student Formators, which was based then at the Social Development Index, a non-government organization founded in order to develop economic and social alternatives and to raise cultural awareness to these alternatives. The support also provided by select college faculty and Jesuits in the university were also tremendously helpful. All that the participation and rallies and mobilizations was also spurred by the fact that many sons and daughters of the political opposition leaders were studying Ateneo at that time, and many have faced their growth of their interest in the protest movement because many political opposition figures were directly talking to Ateneo student leaders. Because of the participation in these political mobilization and activities, we can say, in fact, that the Ateneo Student Fee had significantly contributed to the movement for political and social change. One of the contributions to the student movement was the adoption of nonviolent forms of resistance, mainly due to the pedagogical efforts of Father Joe Blanco in the Aksyon para sa Kapayapaan at Katarungan. Active nonviolence and the work for social justice were the basic tenets of many student leaders at that time. And also in the organization of the Alyansa ng mga Kristiyanong Mag-aral, Student Alliance, which were founded by student leaders from the Ateneo de Manila, Far Eastern University, and the Assumption College. Active nonviolence adopted on principle, but also political expedient, was also political expedient due to the above-ground nature of organizing and mobilization work done by the Ateneo students, especially as a counterpoint to the extreme left student groups such as the League of Filipino Students. And by the late 1980s, ACMA had chapters in several regions in the country, including the different Jesuit institutions. Ateneo de Manila student leaders also have organized the Buklodang Atenista, the Alliance of Student Councils of different Jesuit universities, and also the Democratic Socialist Group Filipino Democratic Students, which was organized also at the University of the Philippines, and also helped in founding the organization of the Pandayan para sa Sosyalistang Pilipinas, one of the major political organizations in the 90s then. Campus political groups such as the Lakas ng Atenista and Hudyat were organized also in the period to raise political awareness and ideological orientation of the student league. Along with other Ateneo faculty and administrators, a crucial role also that the student league was made was on consolidating the middle class and moderate forces against the dictatorship, including the Kongreso ng Mamayang Pilipino or COMPIL, and later the Bagong Alyansa Makabayan, after which many of the left of center and center forces broke away and organized the Bayan Nagkakaisa sa Diwa, Layunin or Pandila. After EDSA, Ateneo student leaders also helped organize the Lakas ng Kabataang Pilipino and Lakas ng Mamayang Pilipino, which was a fulcrum of advocacy efforts of the moderate and some extreme left groups to pursue social justice policies under the Cory Aquino government. There were also many post-EDSA engagements of the student league, such as in the consultations for the 1987 Constitution, progressive agrarian reform, peace advocacy, and other engagements such as fighting for labor rights, urban land reform, advocacies against salvaging and extrajudicial killings, and education reform under the Kilusan ng Kabataan para sa Mapagpalayang Edukasyon Coalition in 1987. Within the campus, there were also many changes that were happening in the mid to late 1980s because of the continuing social and political involvement of students. The introduction of the annual alternative class programs, which was the forerunner of the Talakayang Alay para sa Bayan or TALAB, which was a continuing forum discussion on major social, political, and economic issues. After the EDSA revolution, there were many courses and programs that were developed, such as the AB Major in Development Studies, and courses on peace and social justice taught by Ed Garcia, and the Pedagogy of Liberation taught by Ingrid del Rosario, under the Interdisciplinary Studies Program and Community Organizing under the Development Studies Program. There were also several offices related to student involvement that were expanded, including the Office of Student Activities, which started to organize student volunteers for social involvement, the Cultural Affairs Office, which organized fora, and also the Political Education Program for Students and the Youth, which was organized under the Ateneo Center for Social Policy and Public Affairs. The changes also in these new courses and programs was also spurred the efforts for greater curriculum integration, which we know now as the service learning integration. And these efforts were led by Dr. Manny Uy, then Adi, the Assistant Dean for Student Affairs. The movement for the reform of the Ateneo Student Charter to better democratize Sangguniang decision-making and strengthen sectoral involvement also was undertaken in 1988 to reflect the move towards citizen participation in the new political regime. and a campaign for socialized tuition fee at also the Ateneo to allow for increasing enrollment of the lower and middle classes in the university, which actually failed when it was brought to the Board of Trustees, was undertaken in order to reflect the widening mood for greater access to education. Based on these events, now some of our preliminary thoughts on social and political involvement on the current generation, the involvement of the current generation of students, reflecting on our struggles in the 1980s, in the 90s, and the 80s and 90s are the following. Many student leaders in the Edsa actually were motivated by faith and justice because of the Catholic Church and the Jesuit order. How can we further provide mechanisms or activities to support students to reflect and integrate the Catholic social teaching and work towards social justice and participation in politics? Also, reflection also must be needed to examine the continuing tension between mass consciousness raising, which we are actually undertaking to our enough and core courses, and also volunteer cadre formation. How do we continue our efforts to widen social awareness for all students, but at the same time providing support to a select number of students who want to be better involved in politics and differing venues for social involvement? How can we make the Ateneo student reflect more the social and economic composition of the country? We know that the efforts for social change were mainly spurred by students belonging to the middle and lower middle classes who are more receptive to the advocacies of marginalized groups. And what are the new institutional structures and programs that are necessary to support the involvement of the current generation of students? So on behalf of the panel, I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference for telling the story of the Edsa generation. It is sometimes very easy among the students in the current generation and do not participate in the struggles in the 80s and 90s to pinpoint the failures of Edsa in bringing about social justice and equity reform. But hopefully with conferences like this, men can see that there's a connection with the current struggles of students to address the widespread political and economic justice in the country with that of the Edsa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Randy. We move on to the next presenter. Who's next after Randy? Arj. Okay, Mr. Gire. Okay, so please present. The floor is now yours.
Share screen. There. Okay, so good morning, everyone. So I promise to be brief with my presentation because we still have one more speaker left after me. So my presentation basically is just all about making sense of the responses made by the Ateneo faculty and administration during this period of turmoil, tension, 1992 1982 to 1992. So the questions that I have raised in this chapter or study that I did are what are those moments or openings, opportunities during this period that allowed Ateneo to play an important role in leading the country, making interventions in the society. And number two, again, what are those responses made? Okay, so again, what are the moments and what are the responses made by the Ateneo? So there are two questions, and I will immediately go to the findings of my study. So for the first question, so what are the moments that I have identified during this period? So actually there are four, and these were already discussed by Dr. Benji and Gino, my colleague in the department, and Doc Randy. So later, Ma'am Marge will also highlight some of this. So one is the impasse and the search for an alternative strategy. So this is very crucial, especially in the early 80s. So as mentioned already by Gino Trinidad, Sir Benji, this issue of alternative approach in engaging the Praetorian regime was very crucial and was very important during this period because people were looking for other ways of engaging the regime without resorting to the conventional strongman authoritarian approach from the government, and of course, and of course the violent radical approach from the radical movement from the radical left. So the second opportunity or opening of the period is the Aquino assassination. So this was already mentioned earlier. So it mobilized the people that time. And then number three is the fall of the dictatorship in 1986. And of course, number four, the restoration of democracy. So these are the four openings. And I have, discovered and found that there are two responses that were made by Ateneo. So this was also mentioned earlier by Gino, Mr. Gino Trinidad. So the formulation of an alternative discourse. Alternative discourse also that can be seen as as a political action or political framework, because during that time the government was also using a particular political framework. So it uses the authoritarian framework, strongman rule. So the people again, obviously, some people were not happy about that, and of course other groups, organized groups, they were offering the more radical, the extremist approach. So the Ateneo, through its faculty and administrations, the shifts that were made during this time, the curricula that were introduced, the integration of the socio-political formation that were mentioned earlier, to me, they all lead to this, offering the formulation of alternative discourse or narrative. So later I will go back to this because this active nonviolence approach, to me, it's connected to this. And of course, number two response is the reassertion of the social justice trust. So this is already, part of the workings of the Ateneo University. And during this time, Ateneo made so many interventions in its curricula, in its initiatives that complement this orientation or commitment uh, towards social justice. And let me just highlight one point about here. About this period, 1980 to 1984. The alternative strategy that I mentioned earlier pertains to a new way of looking at the situation. uh, Ateneo offered, a non-violent way of engaging political forces, government, and other groups. And this also allowed Ateneo to deepen and to further introduce nuances, to further its formation tendencies by integrating, the social and the political formations of its students. And then, of course, 1983 to 1986, the crucial period wherein, there were so many mobilizations. The alternative strategy that I've been mentioning earlier, the active nonviolence. Again, this was not, just, popularized by the university. In fact, many of the faculty, administrators were already, thinking about this as early as the 1980s. So Mr. Ed Garcia, for example, a faculty of the Ateneo, is a very well-known advocate of active nonviolence, even in the early 80s. So after the death of, after the assassination of Ninoy, this active nonviolence practice and principle eventually took off, and many seminars and workshops were organized. Some of them were in fact held in Ateneo. So it formed this new generation of advocates of active nonviolence, and in 1986 we saw how this active nonviolence became the very approach or repertoire of the anti-Marcos movement. And restoration and rebuilding, this was already mentioned earlier. So the introduction of the alternative class program. So most of the initiatives, most of the adjustments in the curricula, in the initiatives of Ateneo, they are oriented toward reasserting the social justice trust. So this is one of the legacies of the Ateneo during this period, because it is very consistent about this realization of the social justice trust that helped also the Ateneo to have this claim, okay, especially during this restoration of democratic institutions after EDSA. So the Constitution, for example, the social justice provision there was actually introduced by Ateneo faculty or administrations who were part of the team who drafted the constitution. So for the conclusions, I would just like to highlight that these adjustments, these interventions made during this period, to me they all reveal to us this political education that Ateneo is trying to do. Okay, and in fact this also continued up to this day. That it's not just about this ideological formation. No, it's all about raising the awareness of its students, its community, and of course the people outside the university, raising the awareness, giving them a nuanced view of the situation, and helping them navigate on each. So as the years passed by, Ateneo remained one of the leading institutions that fought the issues that involve mostly the marginalized, issues that involve also the needy. So again, two responses. So they became the very core, or 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 the very orientation of this political education of Ateneo. So again, thank you for listening. So I now turn the floor over to my other colleague, Ma'am Margie. Ma'am Marge.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. We move now to the next top presenter, Miss Marge. Okay, I'm sorry, Miss Marge, we have only about 5 minutes and before we eat into the before the next
Okay.
session. So
Yes, I
I'm sorry
promise.
about this, Marge. Huh? I'm sorry about
No
this.
problem. No problem. Just let me know. But I promise to make it very short. So this is my. Let me just put this on. Okay. Okay. So good morning to everyone. I will be talking today about the pioneering episode. Pioneering efforts in social development undertaken through the work of two NGOs, the Center for Community Services and the Ateneo Center for Social Policy and Public Affairs. So these are two NGOs that were operating under the Social Development Complex from 1982 to 1992, which was the scope of coverage of the second volume of the Down from the Hill book. Okay, so the Center for Community Services, the first center, was established as early as 1978, and it was established to centralize the work of four separate but already existing offices. So the Workers' College, OSCI, ORD, and LICAS. Okay. So these were some of the programs that were introduced that were operating under the CCS. Okay. So the second center is the Ateneo Center for Social Policy and Public Affairs, which was formed in 1986 as the Social Political Institute of the Ateneo. So this was post EDSA, and this was at a time when we were already experiencing some restoration of freedoms after the end of martial law. Okay. So it had a two-pronged approach. One was to conscientize grassroots organizations, and second was for the social orientation of legislators and other policymakers. So these two centers, okay, so these are some of the programs that the Center for Social Policy operated upon its establishment. And these projects and programs would evolve over time. But a constant in its efforts was the idea of facilitating more effectively and efficiently people's participation in democratic processes. So what were the gains that were made through the work of CCS and CST? They formed only a part of the social development complex, but these were the two centers that we studied. One is the institutional support that it gave for serving the poor. So while the two centers were established at varying points in history and to serve different purposes, CCS and CSP together provided the institutional support through its programs and services to enable the Ateneo community to reach out and serve the poor. Second is the empowerment of basic sectors. So CCS and CSP, through their work, built up their partner organizations in labor, urban poor, farmers, and other sectors like the youth and students. They also provided key services for the poor. That includes livelihood support, health programs, pastoral formation, political education, and community-based research, among others. So in the process, these interventions enabled the people to participate more actively and find their voice in the political arena. So the third was that it provided a space for engagement with the state. And this is particularly refers to the work of the Center for Social Policy. No? They provided a concrete venue through which the poor could engage with and be heard by legislators and other stakeholders on important issues of the day. For example, at the time, under discussion were the US bases, agrarian reform, and others. Okay. So, fourth was the building of alliances. So, both CCS and CSP were involved in the development of coalitions, in building alliances and networks within and among the sectors that they worked with. Okay, so this was seen in the case of labor with Piglas Kamao and LMLC, with peasants, with Sandigan and Pakisama and Sipar, and with the urban poor, with the Urban Poor Forum. With the youth and students, both CCS and CSP were involved with ACMA. Okay. So finally, is the formation process that both CCS and CSP were engaged in, which they offered to different groups, which included the students and community youth and the other basic sectors. So apart from this, the formation process that CCS and CSP were engaged in also contributed to the formation of a whole generation of social development workers, shepherding their participation from social involvement to work that was more social political and eventually ideological in nature. So this same formation also fed into the formal curriculum of the Ateneo, providing input, for instance, into specific classes like ECO 177 or programs such as the Development Studies program. So the premise in this is that the beneficiaries of this formation process and now carry with them the basic values that were in that formation process. For example, authentic Christian humanism, the preferential option for the poor. All these things were now um, in their mind wherever they now perform roles of leadership and authority. So, just a final point. So, what have we learned from the experience of the STC through CCS and CSP? 35 years after EDSA, we continue to face a number of social problems that we faced back then, even then. Poverty, corruption, creeping restrictions on our rights and freedoms, violations of human rights. All these continue to face us today. What lessons now can we derive from the experience of CCS and CSP to inform our efforts to confront these problems? So we identified 4 points. And the first is setting directions and taking stock. So we saw that one of the reflections was that if the Ateneo community is set on finding its niche in the effort to respond to the social problems that plague the Philippines today, it needs a concerted and deliberate effort approach to the problem grounded on some stock taking. And ideally, this direction setting should involve all stakeholders. So, apart from the Jesuit community, it should involve members of the faculty, staff, students, as well as the Ateneo based NGOs and institutions. Okay. So second is the empowerment of basic sectors. So we see that the experience of the 80s tells us that in the face of repression, violation of human rights, and other growing threats to democracy, organizing of communities and the establishment of people's organizations is key. An empowered and critical citizenry is key. Second is the importance of investing information. So, analytical skills, critical thinking have never been more valuable in the face of the onslaught of fake news, for example. There's also a need for a conscious effort to transmit values such as active nonviolence, authentic Christian humanism, and the preferential option for the poor especially at this time. So it is key that a formation process that promotes such skills and values, this plays an important role in this conjuncture. Finally, is the engagement with the state. The opportunities to engage with government provide uniquely different challenges to us compared to the period immediately following EDSA. And the state, regardless of the administration, is not monolithic. Opportunities to engage government, whether through LGUs, line agencies, and commissions, among others, in these lie potential areas for partnership and cooperation. So with that, I'd like to end my presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much, Marge, for that presentation. Inabot na tayo ng 11:55. I think we have eaten into the time period of the next panel. So let me just thank the whole panel, Benji, Randy, Arj, Gino, and who else? Yeah, wala na. Okay, so thank you, and Arj. Thank you very much. Huh? And before we move on to the next panel, just a little commercial from the Ateneo de Manila University Press. They brought us very good news for today. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Tolosa, Mr. Trinidad, and Dr. Tuano, Mr. Aguirre, for your presentations. And I would also like to thank Dr. Mendoza for facilitating our second panel. So, okay. All right. So our partner for today's event, Ateneo de Manila University Press, has an announcement to everyone joining us. In remembrance of the 35th anniversary of the EDSA People Power Revolution and in the spirit of keeping its legacies alive, the Ateneo University Press is offering their catalog of martial law and Marcos era related titles at 30% off for a limited time only at their Lazada store. This catalog has a wide selection of titles written about martial law, the Marcos years, and the EDSA People Power Revolution, from landmark titles like Some Are Smarter Than Others, The Conjugal Dictatorship, Unionista, The Chronicle of a Social Justice Crusader, Down from the Hill, Ateneo de Manila's First 10 Years Under Martial Law, and many other titles. Kindly check the link provided to view the catalog. Also, you can visit the Ateneo Press Store at Lazada to avail of the on-sale titles. The promo is valid today until February 28 only. Another eye-opening title that tells a book of the martial law years is coming soon to Ateneo University Press. This book, Ascending the Fourth Mountain, written by Maria Virginia Yap Morales, is her personal account of the Marcos years, the widespread participation of women against violations of human rights and sexual abuse under military detention, and the struggle for equality within a revolutionary movement. You can reserve your copy now by going to the link provided or email Ateneo Press at marketing.unipress@ateneo.edu. All right, we now move on to our last panel for this morning. The next panel is entitled The Youth, Martial Law, and Human Rights. I now give the screen to Dr. Maria Estela Banasihan, Lecturer, Department of History, Ateneo de Manila University, who will be serving as the facilitator for this panel.
Thank you, John Jay. Hello, everyone. So we shall be continuing our conversation about EDSA 35, moments, legacies, and uncertainties. And yes, you are here, panel 3A, the youth, martial law, and human rights. I think it's a good introduction of the first panel or the panel before us actually discussed already student activism. And this is going to be our focus for today. So again, I'm Stella Banasian from History Department at Ateneo de Manila University. I will facilitate the process. But before we start, let me remind you that if you have questions, clarifications, please use the chat box, and we will read through that through the chat box later on, not for open forum. As we are given 1 hour in this panel, we will be devoting 15 minutes per topic. We have 3 topics and 4 speakers, so 15 minutes or so per topic, and the remaining minutes will be for our question and answer and open forum. So we have 3 interesting topics today, which will be shared by equally interesting people, experts in the field of history, political science, sociology, and human rights law. All right. So just to start with the first speaker. So let's dive into it already. So the first speaker is Professor Michael D. Pante, Assistant Professor at the Department of History, Ateneo de Manila University, and Associate Editor of Philippine Studies, Historical Ethnographic Viewpoints. He is the author of A Capital City at the Margins, Quezon City Urbanization in the 20th Century Philippines. This was published by Ateneo Press in 2019. All right, so to continue, the topic that he will be sharing with us will be how not to depoliticize a campus, the University of the Philippines under authoritarian rule. So this is going to be so interesting because this is very much relevant nowadays. So let's have my friends, Professor Michael D. Pante.
Salamat, Stella.
Hello,
And
Mike.
yes, quite timely if
Yes.
you've been following the news these past few months, beginning January 2020 with the abrogation of the UP DND Accord. It makes this presentation timely, how not to depoliticize a campus. I simply want to look at how the geography of UP played a role in the toppling of the authoritarian regime and the ironies that were underneath all these structures that led to the Marcos's ouster. So I want to begin with sorry. There. I want to begin kita ba? I want to begin with this page from a transcript where you have 2 people speaking. One is named Benedicto. The other one is named Press or President, short for President. It's actually part of a transcript, the last page of a transcript dated Feb 25, 1938 between then President Manuel Quezon, President of the Philippine Commonwealth, and the University Student Council President Roberto Benedicto. According to Benedicto, and the topic of the conversation was with regards to the upcoming relocation of the University of the Philippines. As we all know, when UP was first established in 1908, the campus was in Ermita. And by the 1930s, when Manuel Quezon was already president of the Commonwealth, he was one of the advocates of relocating the campus to somewhere else, to a place where it's quote-unquote more fitting. It's more conducive to academic learning. However, the University Student Council, led by their president Roberto Benedicto, challenged this position. And in fact, they protested against the president for advocating this. And in that conversation, there was a dialogue, private dialogue between the student council leaders and President Manuel Quezon. Benedicto ended that dialogue by saying, Manila is a city where the student is in direct touch with the struggles of life, and it offers the best opportunity for the student to fit himself for life's battle. And the answer of Manuel Quezon to Benedicto's claim is quite telling. Because Quezon says, his reply was, it's precisely because the university is in Manila that I think it should be transferred to another place away from this city. So clearly, it's not just about creating a conducive academic atmosphere. It's not just about creating conditions where where students would be less distracted. Politics had to do with it. Manuel Quezon felt that in Manila, the capital, the center of political affairs, it was quote-unquote contaminating the minds of these students. And many of these students were already participating in political rallies during that time. And Quezon did not want that to happen. So this was a tussle between Quezon, the figure of quote-unquote authoritarianism in the Commonwealth period, challenged by a student leader by the name of Roberto Benedicto. But I think many of us here are familiar with the name Roberto Benedicto, sounds familiar? Yes, he is. It's the same Roberto Benedicto who would appear during the Marcos period as one of the chief cronies of President Ferdinand Marcos. And what makes this all the more ironic and tragicomic, if you ask me, in this country we have so many situations of tragedies being repeated farcically as far as a few decades after. What we have is that during that time, Ferdinand Marcos was himself a student activist, and he was one of those students rallying against Manuel Quezon's decision to transfer UP from Ermita to Diliman. How ironic is that? Marcos participating in a rally, but as we all know, that decision by Manuel Quezon was eventually implemented. UP was in fact moved from its main campus, its main campus was moved from Ermita to Diliman. And when that happened, and when Marcos was already president by 1960s, that Diliman campus would serve as a very important locus for student activists and for student protests against his own regime. So we all know Diliman as a hotbed of activism during the Marcos period. But what were the conditions behind the creation of this atmosphere of activism? It's quite ironic because if you think about it, going back to Quezon's reasons why he wanted to move the UP campus from Ermita to Diliman was to remove politics from the equation. Ermita was at the core of the civic center of the government near the Supreme Court, near Malacanang, and near other schools, creating a quote-unquote university belt, and that politicized a lot of students during the Commonwealth period. So what he wanted was a location quite far from the center of politics because he wanted UP students to be quote-unquote brought under a more strict and wholesome supervision and control, and that the proper spirit and atmosphere may be created on the university campus. And for him, Diliman was the perfect choice because it was a, quote-unquote, a more appropriate site away from the noise of the city, which detracts from the serene life of the scholar. But as I've already pointed out, it's not just about this quote-unquote noise. It has to do with radical politics. And by that time, and I have here a clipping from the Philippines Free Press, in 1932, communism was already a factor in the radicalization of student politics as early as 1932, even before the Commonwealth period. And so as the Commonwealth progressed, you see more students participating in rallies and demonstrations. The Hair Horse Cutting Act was one of the contentious points at that time, and Quezon did not want a repeat of that kind of situation when he was already sitting as president in Malacanang. But when the student body and even the professors challenged Quezon, Quezon was adamant, saying that even the professors cannot threaten me if they ever attempted to resign, meaning the professors wanted to resign as a sign of protest. I'll accept the resignation of every professor and dean, including the university president himself, saying, adding, I can run this university without a single man of those now constituting the faculty. If necessary, I shall bring professors from every nation of the world. And then saying, I am tired of seeing the UP students making demonstrations or approving resolutions on public or political questions. There will be no politics in the UP. Quite unequivocal terms coming from the president himself. And yes, Quezon would succeed in his position. The transfer would eventually happen. Diliman was part of this newly created city named after Quezon, established in 1939. You have Quezon City created as this distant space away from Manila, but still accessible via motor vehicles, and it's quite far in 1930s terms. Pero syempre not today in 2021. But during those years, it was quite far. It was a travel from going from Ermita, passing through Quezon Avenue, and then lalagpas ng Edsa for you to reach UP Diliman campus, which is already near Manila, near Marikina. And at that time, people were already thinking of the possible contamination of ideas. People were wondering about what would happen to the students being so near to the places of vice, even prostitution. You have a editorial cartoon here from the Philippine Graphic, but by and large, it was an insulated space. People called it the Diliman Republic. As early as the 1952, you already have newspapers here from the Sunday Times Magazine calling the UP Diliman campus a republic of its own because of its isolated location, of its self-sufficiency, so to speak. It was divorced from the rest of Manila society. But how divorced was this? I want to challenge that point because well, this is also Ateneo. I'm just trying to show Ateneo being people there in Ateneo also wanting to replicate that move. In fact, what they envisioned initially was was a space somewhere near Balintawak Cloverleaf today. But that's for another story. I don't have time to tackle that. But yes, around the same time the Diliman campus was completed, Ateneo also had its own campus beside it. As we all know, it's at Loyola Heights. But back then, people just simply refer to it as Balara. But I mean, Ateneo being Ateneo, I don't think Ateneo would want it to be called Ateneo de Balara. So let's call it Loyola Heights so that it's Tunog Atenista. And even in Loyola Heights, the first groups, the first set of students studying there felt that it was too far from civilization. And you had this, actually, it's medyo tone deaf, yung mga editorial cartoons noon, trying to depict Loyola Heights as a place of savagery, as a place full of trees, vegetation, possible Japanese stragglers being found in the university campus. And this was these were editorial cartoons published in the Guidon. So you could just imagine the kind of atmosphere that Diliman also had at that time. But quite the opposite, what you had in Diliman was not really a place of total disconnect from the rest of society because you already had, as early as the 1950s, informal settlers in areas such as Bago Bantay, in present-day North Edsa near a huge shopping mall there. And then you have the sprouting of other informal communities. So you have here in Quezon City, those black areas there, they show you the extent of informal communities by the 1960s. So we're not talking about a recent period here. This is the 1960s, at the time when student radicalism was once again showing its force in Diliman. So it went against the assumption of President Manuel Quezon that once you move Diliman, once you move UP to a distant location, politics would be out of the question. Quite the contrary. Ang nangyari, the presence of informal settlers became a radicalizing force among the students. And you will see that in the infamous Diliman Commune episode of 1971, which we celebrated just a few weeks earlier. Diliman Commune could not have happened without the help of informal communities present in Diliman itself, inside the campus itself. As mentioned by this publication, which was released at the height of the Diliman Commune, the communards in Diliman were saying, ang teritoryo ng UP Diliman ay maraming kagalingan kaysa sa ibang lugar para sa pagtatag ng isang malayang purok ng estilo ng isang commune, parallel to the Paris Commune. Bakit daw? Why was it appropriate? Why was it an appropriate site? Because you have a wide space, may mga bakante sa mga kabahayan, samantala ang kanyang likuran ay may mga base ng populasyon na maaaring pagtaguan sa panahon ng pananalakay mula sa labas. And that's what actually happened when there were state forces trying to arrest students. They were able to evade arrest by hiding amongst the informal communities present in Diliman itself, and they were already organizing them. So many of these communities became a safe haven for these students at the time of state repression. And so in Diliman, you have not just one, not two, but a lot of informal communities. I think the earliest was at Arboretum, near New Era University. But aside from that, you have the places of Balara, Culyat, Inripada, Pansol, Cruz Naligas. These were all low-income communities which emerged there precisely because you needed infrastructure to build UP. But who would build such infrastructure? You need cheap labor, and many of these workers who provided the cheap labor for the construction projects had no homes near Diliman because Diliman was distant from the center of the city. They had to build their own barong-barong makeshift dwellings near Diliman. So that's the end result here. One of the key places of one of the key informal communities present in Diliman was in North Triangle, which was also a place of radicalism for people like John Kimpo. As already documented by his siblings, Susan Kimpo, in the books of Subversive Lives, Jam was supposedly happy visiting and spending time with squatter families who live on the future site of the Philippine Science High School in North Triangle. And these families eked out a living quarrying blocks. They lived in jerry-built shacks, cast of corrugated sheets for roofing, and the usual narrative we have of students in UP being radicalized is that they would be taken to exposure trips outside Metro Manila. But during that time, you need not go far because as near as North Triangle, you can already see poverty there up close. And so this was the Little Isabela for John Kimpo, which ultimately radicalized him, contributed to his radicalization, and led to him joining the CPP-NPA. And you have a lot of stories like John Kimpo. You even have Atenistas forming their own communities, committees to live in Constitution Hills, which was one of the biggest informal settler communities at that time. And you see here a dynamic between informal settler communities and the radicalization of campus, which was an ironic twist given that initially Quezon wanted it to become a place of depoliticized academic atmosphere. So that's my presentation. I hope you gained something from it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mike. Very interesting. So, there's one key word that I really love from your sharing when you said something about the location, no? The location of it. And something I remember like geography of student activism, how you locate, how you position, and how you open the bed for radicalization. Thank you, Mike. And that will also link us to the next topic. So let me quickly now introduce our next speaker, Mr. Hansley A. Juliano. He is a doctoral candidate undergraduate school of International Development, Nagoya University, under the Japanese government scholarship program. Prior to his doctoral studies, he served as faculty of the Department of Political Science, Ateneo de Manila University, from the years 2013 to 2020, and has participated in civil society, sectoral movement advocacies related to land rights, electoral reform, and labor rights. And he did research for the same time period. His topic is on student activism in Philippine politics, contentious portrayals over the decades. Friends, here's Professor Hansley Juliano.
Sorry, is my slide visible?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay,
Welcome.
good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. And I realized that my presentation dovetails a lot with Dr. Pante's work, so I will take a different direction. For the purposes of transparency, I would like to advise that this paper is an outline in progress, so comments and criticisms are highly welcome. To set the tone, I would like to share this short paragraph I usually see when it comes to student protests. And I quote, "The main contradiction of liberal democracy is that it has largely been shaped through a history of various forms of illegal civil disobedience. Such civil disobedience is retrospectively seen as justified, and the people committing it are seen as heroes, but each successive generation is asked to believe that any further civil disobedience would be unreasonable. If that paragraph rings a bell, this is kind of the tone that I will be dealing with in this presentation. As mentioned earlier by Dr. Pante, last January 18, 2021, the Department of National Defense terminated the accord with the UP system to not send in security forces, which was signed as a response towards the persecution of student activists under the dictatorship of Marcos. This accord, and by extension this legal framing of academic freedom, has since become a vital part of the narrative of student activism in UP, and by extension other state and public universities in the Philippines. So not surprisingly, alumni of the UP system reacted vociferously against this institutional attack, especially with the Duterte government's failure of leadership. We don't need to go into detail that right now. However, we do have to acknowledge that this issue of academic freedom and freedom of expression has not exactly been met with widespread enough public disapproval, especially when we compare to the more heated public support for activism and anti-government protests in our neighboring Southeast Asian countries. While student activism in the Philippines has become normalized and indeed valorized in Philippine scholarship and creative literature, it remains a contentious aspect for a significant section of Philippine society, particularly in middle class and lower class families. Family dramas and tensions due to either the organizational choices of students to take part in activist organizations or eventually enter development in civil society work has been documented and discussed. Memoirs, fiction and nonfiction, as well as contemporary news reportage. The legacy of left-leaning movements in the Philippines has indeed relied on the tapping of youth activism, and it continues to permeate the stereotypical narrative of student activism, more often than not for the better. Even if student activism and youth-based politics has already developed and straddled over class distinctions over the previous 3 decades. It must be pointed out, of course, that this question is not new. After all, historically, narratives of youth participation in contested politics, be it during the Second World War, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Vietnam War in the United States, the Thammasat University Massacre in Thailand, Tiananmen Square in China, the Hong Kong democracy protests, current protest actions in Thailand and Myanmar, and also the global climate change movement, always deals with the question of the viability, safety, and strategic value of youth activism. What is notable, however, is that despite these, youth activist movements all over the world have managed to not only organize, but also become major actors, sometimes even faces, in their countries. The same, however, may not exactly be the case for the Philippines. Why is this so? For this presentation, perhaps the framing argument of 3 scholars I'm referring to will be a bit helpful. First, I refer to Sarah Ahmed's conception of affect theory, how emotions involve bodily process of affecting and being affected, how we come into contact with objects and others, and how this intensity of bodily responses direct people to make judgments about worlds, and those judgments directive even if they do not follow narrative rules of sequence or cause and effect. She particularly notes how the utilization of fear, particularly the fear of a certain kind of sector, group, organization, political actors, works to align bodily and social space, which may be useful in identifying the political-moral dimension of the bogey and the negative narratives imputed to student activism. Much of this, of course, were already referred to by Dr. Pante earlier. Second, Martelli and Garalite draws on their study of South Asian universities in the Indian subcontinent and how they maintain generational communities of activist networks. Generational communities are defined as self-selected communities in which a set of networked and youthful cohorts are engaged directly or indirectly with formal or informal education. To quote at length, their distinctiveness lies in their production at the micro level of shared thinking, self-fashioning, and framing perspectives in grids of understanding, as well as formative engagements with macro-social political terms. And hence, generational communities can be more inclusive, fluid, relational, processual, dynamic, and eventful. This particular frame, not surprisingly, can also directly apply to the environment of the University of the Philippines system, which has produced generations of student leaders and activists who have subsequently entered public affairs in different capacities, even across different sides of the Philippine spectrum. Third, Talita Espiritu's work, Passionate Revolution, works in the same vein as Ahmed in identifying the sentimental politics, both of the Marcos state and the EDSA-affiliated movements, which colors historiography and therefore contemporary political imagery of them today. To quote her directly, reconstructing the first quarter storm from Lacaba's reports from the Philippine Free Press, the youth parliaments of the states constituted a just political space of political contestation, and their medium of dissent, passionate and hyper-embodied performances of radical subalternity, seemed to open up a new and exciting space of political action. But Marcos's mass media counter-subversive war was itself a national allegory, one that otherized the young dissidents even as it appropriated anti-colonial politics of the radical left. End quote. This polar narrative of the moral authority of the government of the day and the opposition to it by the youth, therefore socially unacceptable, is still running against the democratic politics of the young, persisting in contemporary perspectives to this day. Which brings us to a closer look into the general community of UP Diliman for the purposes of this presentation. So one can characterize the space development of UP Diliman as well as other campuses, depending on who you ask, as caught in this tension between mass and middle class since the 1960s. The UP system, after all, was originally built by the American colonial government as a training ground for the emerging technocracy of the Philippine state. Its leadership, and by extension its student body, was designed to sustain the institutional demands of the state. And this perspective has not disappeared from the institutional view of the national government. Hence, all of these criticisms regarding is UP being funded by the taxpayer doing its job if it continues to protest. At the same time, despite this origin, it also has been traditionally seen as a vehicle for upward mobility, much like higher education all over the world. Unsurprisingly, because of this fostering of students and alumni who may espouse either state-aligned or more liberal perspectives, it was inevitable that this emerging educated middle class will figure in the leadership of both the Marcos technocracy and the civil society leftist opposition, as documented by Tadem in her works. Since the Marcos years and the EDSA revolution, personal, organizational, and professional networks inside the university have dovetailed to either foster more amicable political engagements in both formal and informal spheres, as well as intensify partisan debates along such lines. The university, its generational community, as well as its extended networks becomes a possible neutral zone for political ideas in policy advocacies. But it can also be read along the lines of the Gramscian concept of transformismo, the political process whereby radical pressures are gradually absorbed and inverted by conservative forces until they serve the opposite of their original ends. The geographic proximity to middle to upper class universities, such as, of course, the Ateneo de Manila and Miriam College, also allowed for the crossbreeding of political and ideological projects. UP, Miriam, and Ateneo have shared a legacy of opposition to the Marcos dictatorship, with scores of alumni and faculty numbering among the activists, development workers, civil society leaders, and politicians persecuted and killed by the dictatorship. Indeed, over the years, it has become normalized that national issues that warrant student or youth engagement, especially as decided by these communities, these universities' communities and student councils, have almost always involving the building of alliances and the hosting of collective actions by these three universities. In essence, it does facilitate the radicalization of student politics in these universities, despite the socioeconomic exclusivity, the elite student body and alumni network, as well as predilection for more moderate centrist politics. Nevertheless, intra-class influences go both ways. The continued gentrification of the Katipunan area, where Ateneo and Miriam are situated, also occurred in the Diliman area of UP, directly affecting its surrounding environs. Particular emphasis in the literature has been given to the partnership UP Diliman has with Ayala Corporation, which has, we now know, of course, Ayala Techno Hub and the UP Town Center, which has contributed to the continuing gentrification, not only of the space, but also the culture of the student body, both in the undergraduate and graduate levels. Space gentrification has also contributed to the slow but sure edging out of former communities and residents and low-income actors long established on campus. The perceived massa and more pedestrian culture and upbringing of a UP student over the years is slowly but surely, and this is not me just talking, this is documented by other scholarship and even some anecdotal evidence, is slowly but surely becoming more of an aspiration, idealized view than an actual shared narrative by the thousands of students that step and take part in the UP system. So what therefore does this imply? For all intents and purposes, despite the self-image of UP's generational community as being more massa or people-oriented, continuous changes in its demographics and by extension, its internal socio-political culture contributes perhaps not to the widening of this generational community, but towards its contraction. In practice, this therefore means that the activist tradition the university continues to foster may, despite appearances and numbers, be isolated from the larger pool of the Filipino public, which may have a stake and interest in the fostering of our students and the idea of activism and civil responsibility in general. This furthermore provides ripe opportunities for interest groups affiliated with religious and social conservatism to build their own alternative ideological network, be it within, outside, or between campuses, as fodder for state-leaning moral politics, hence the constituency for the incumbent administration. Contemporary documented middle-class tensions and isolation from larger population is already providing fodder for inter-class aggressions, as documented in recent works by Cornelio, Enlasco, Pusaka, and Thompson. The democratic aspiration represented by student activism, not through its specific faults, but because of the current situation, runs the risk of being perceived as a privileged exercise. So admittedly, there's much still to write in this line of narrative, particularly the generational communities of Miriam and Ateneo itself, in whose environs this idea of privileged activism is more apparent and explicit. In the interest of time and opportunity for further discussion, I shall conclude for now with the following summary. While student activism, particularly in the UP system, has had historical ties to the underground movements and opposition to authority in the Philippines, this relationship has been complicated by ground and socioeconomic realities within the university itself. Nevertheless, the iconography and ideology of student activism continues to be maintained, nurtured and marketed by UP's own generational communities. Which in turn, this invites pushback from more conservative leaning interests within Philippine society, be they inside or outside the university. Now, there are implications for the idea of the university. University spaces in themselves continue to be contested political spaces and should be maintained so for the purposes of freedom of speech, assembly, and education. After all, these are international norms and values being upheld. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that the potential isolation of student activism discourse and lifestyles, demographics from a growing section of Philippine society, both middle and lower class, can point to the persistence of suspicion and persecution of the idea of the open and liberal university environment. So thank you very much for your time. I will be welcoming questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Juliano. So actually, I was agitated when you say something portrayal of student activism. In a way, we try to reflect now, how do we portray, or what image do we have right now of student activism? Your topic is now linked to our next topic, which be presented to us by a partnership of Attorney Ruby Togade and Professor Athena Presto. Athena Presto is a sociologist, is also a proud provinciana. She was a former president and current advisor of UP Namnama, the foremost organization of Ilocano students at the University of the Philippines. She graduated summa cum laude and now teaches at the UP Diliman Department of Sociology. Attorney Ruby Togade is a lawyer with extensive experience in human rights. And she is also a lecturer in the University of the Philippines College of Law and Department of Political Science at the Ateneo de Manila University, where she obtained her Juris Doctor and Bachelor of Arts degrees respectively. She earned her Master of Laws from the University of Peace and United Nations Inter-Regional Crime and Justice Research Institute in Turin, Italy. The topic will be on demystifying the Marcos and Edsa legacy reflected in the Solid North. Friends, here are Professor Presto and Attorney Togade.
Good afternoon, everyone. Unfortunately, Professor Presto won't be able to join us, so I will be presenting this ongoing study on her behalf as well. Just to preface my presentation, full disclosure, my maternal roots are located in Lawag, Ilocos Norte. Meanwhile, Professor Presto is a full-blooded Ilocana, born and raised in Vigan City. So this study was inspired mostly by our lived experiences, growing up in Ilocano households. So let me now proceed to the main discussion. So the solid north is a particular phrase that has gained currency starting with the rise of President Marcos and up to now. Ilocanos have a strong ethnic capital that is felt in various provinces across the Philippines and the world, where there is a substantive Ilocano population due to the Ilocano diaspora. Ilocanos can be protective and can fall into common regionalist tropes, especially towards the legacy of Ferdinand Marcos, or how most Ilocanos know him, Apolacay. The Solid North is bound not only by common language or traditions, but also of a particular political position that stays characteristic of regionalism within the Philippine archipelago. The stereotype on the Solid North, composed mainly of the provinces of Ilocos Norte, Ilocos Sur, La Union, and Pangasinan, is that Ilocanos are pro-Marcos or more Marcos loyalists, full stop. Though we know that this is not the case, and not all Marcos loyalists are Ilocanos, the stereotype persists as it is not totally unfounded. We see today the Marcoses' continued grip on political power. Recently, the Philippine Supreme Court put finality into the contested 2016 vice presidential elections between Bongbong Marcos and Leni Robredo, with Marcos trying to gain the position of the vice presidency through an electoral protest. And there's also the electoral victory of Amy Marcos in the 2019 senatorial elections, where she landed the top spot in the traditionally solid north provinces. There's also the continued grip of power of the Marcoses and their descendants in the Ilocos region. And then recently, last September, we've heard of the proposed Marcos Day legislation from the House of Representatives, which commemorates the legacy of Ferdinand Marcos and proposes a holiday in his memory in the Ilocos region. So the cultural reproduction of the Marcos myth spans generations. So it spans the older generations who experience the Marcos years firsthand to the millennials and the Gen Zs who are learning about the Marcos years through stories, anecdotes from these older generations, and the reproduction through social media and mass media of the Marcos legacy as well. The Marcosian myth-making machinery is fiercest in the hometown of Ferdinand Marcos in the Ilocos region. The socialization of children, such as in the form of field trips, stories, and monuments or landmarks, are strong in that particular region and Ilocano households. During our discussion of this presentation, Ms. Presto and I have discovered a common experience that when we were young, we were both brought to the Batak Memorial Museum containing the wax figure of Ferdinand Marcos as part of the field trip of our respective elementary educational institutions. And then there are also stories like that of the urban legend that refers to their flight to Hawaii. So instead of Poway, the Marcos family was flown to Hawaii as they fled Malacanang. So these are some of the handed down stories to younger generations of Ilocanos. So the Marcos family remains politically formidable, actively participating in the interpretation of the past and taking advantage of its present negation and renegotiation. So ever since the Marcoses returned to political power, they have successfully maintained their positionality. This, of course, necessitated the capture of the fascination and adoration of the Ilocano youth in particular. So an example of this, which we like to cite as an illustration, is Amy Marcos establishing the Siri Ilocano Kabataan Association, or SICA, an organization of youth leaders from her constituent province of Ilocos Norte. So she has also launched Sirib Express, which won the Galing Pook Award, spearheaded by the Department of Interior and Local Government. And this project serves as liaison for youth development activities in the Ilocos region in particular. And also, Amy Marcos constantly participates in youth-driven or youth-centric activities such as the Palarong Pambansa. So these are just examples of how the members of the Marcos family, descendants of the dictator, have actively participated in rehabilitating their image, especially in the eyes of the Filipino youth. Collective memory is a resource for patron-clientelistic relations. We have seen this happening in the past election cycles. For example, now President Duterte often expresses appreciation of Army Marcos as governor of Luzon, who supported his candidacy and therefore delivered votes for him in the 2016 election. Senator Poe, when she ran as president, flirted with references to the legacy of Apo Lakay for his infrastructure projects, so she could also gain ground on the electorate in the Luzon Island. In Pangasinan, Governor Espino and Representative Coangco, who are known members of the families which have opposed the Marcoses, have supported Bongbong Marcos's vice presidential run. Miriam Defensor Santiago, who was then a trial judge, whose fame hinged on her initial fame hinged on her defiance of the whims of the Marcos dictatorship, eventually recruited Bongbong Marcos, or allied with Bongbong Marcos as her vice president candidate in the 2016 elections. We must also remember that President Duterte's mother was a staunch supporter of the anti-Marcos movements in Davao. So for a generation that did not witness firsthand the rule of a homegrown tyrant, stories from relatives and statements from politicians are profound influences that are enough to justify the belief of the heroism of Ferdinand Marcos. And after all, it's the state and the family that are the strongest institutions in the Philippines. Adding to this is the legal institution that is now trying to the legal institutions that are now participating in that active renegotiation of the Marcos legacy. So there's inconsistency in the way the legal institutions have dealt with their legacy, and that somehow complicates the way the Marcos legacy is negotiated. So briefly, let's look at the legal architecture after the EDSA regime. So this is the legacy of EDSA in terms of laws and legal rules after the end of the dictatorship. So primarily, the 1987 Constitution, it's a reckoning with history. So the records of the deliberations are replete with references to the Marcos dictatorship as something that has to be actively rejected by way of this constitution. In legislation, there's the creation of the Philippine Commission on Good Government that's tasked to recover ill-gotten wealth, the Commission on Human Rights to guard against the future repetition of abuses that happened during the martial law years, and then more recently, Republic Act 10368, establishing the HRVCB, which gave monetary and non-monetary compensation as form of reparation to the victims of martial law, and actually legally recognizing the fact of human rights abuses during the dictatorship. This is where it gets interesting. It's the judicial formulation of the Marcoses legacy. So we have the 1989 case of Marcos versus Manglapos, where the Supreme Court in strong terms rejected the return of the Marcoses physically to the Philippines stating that the president then Corazon Aquino was right in her, or was legally correct in her position, that the Marcos family can be barred from returning to the Philippines to avoid any form of disruption into the political landscape. Then there's Republic versus Sandigan Bayan in 2003 and other forfeiture cases, which affirmed the fact that there was ill-gotten wealth on the part of the Marcoses, and they have to return this to the coffers of the government. But it gets interesting. In 2016, there's Ocampo versus Enriquez, which somehow reversed or flipped this long line of cases which cemented seemingly the EDSA legacy. In Ocampo versus Enriquez, the court said there is no legal impediment to the burial of Ferdinand Marcos in the libingan ng mga bayani, and it's a political question that lies within the prerogative of the president. So obviously, a hagiography has been built around Ferdinand Marcos, especially among older Ilocanos. The dictatorship was seen by a segment of Ilocanos as a source of pride and sense of prosperity. Meanwhile, those who resisted this collective memory, at least within and between and among Ilocanos, are discredited. We have seen in the first part of this discussion how it's actually very, very complicated, because you have the state on the one hand, and legal institutions saying that this is the path that must be taken by the Philippines after the dictatorship. But then you have stories handed down to generations of Ilocanos. It could be said that there are always new ways of remembering and forgetting, and while stories handed down in Ilocano households persist, the human rights record and economic crimes of the Marcoses can also be a robust source of a different way of remembering. An approach that totally in wholesale rejects the solid north as pure myth or the Ilocano collective memory might not be entirely helpful. Instead, the call is to reevaluate the past through its nuances. For instance, in UP Diliman, Ilocano students have founded a student organization, UP Namnama, as an opposition to the Marcos regime at the height of martial law. Ilocano millennials today participate in conversations regarding the legacy of the Marcoses and a subsequent revolution in EDSA and also its attendant legacy. So making sweeping conclusions on the solid north as either existing or non-existing actually distracts us from understanding the totality and the implications of the Marcos legacy and the alternate legacy of the EDSA revolution. Thank you. You may contact us through our email addresses or through Twitter, through these handles and these email addresses. That's it on my end, and I will be welcoming your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Tugade. That was very interesting. What I was actually struck by what you said, like the youth being used for reconstruction of the myth, no, the Marcos myth, and at the same time, it brings to mind what type of reconstructions that is, or reconstructions that are being done nowadays, no, specifically using the youth, no. All right, so I look at the chat box, but we weren't able to see some questions. Perhaps they can actually email you, but because you have given them your email addresses, please do so. Dear audience, please do so if you are interested to know more. These things will be posted on the Facebook of Ateneo Department of History, so you can look for their contact numbers, their contact emails there. But there's one comment, no, but from Gino Antonio Trinidad saying something like this. I think this was during Mike Pante's sharing. It is very interesting how much supposed depoliticization is connected with issues of urban sprawl. What do you think about this, Mike?
Yes, of course. And thank you, Gino, for the comment. I think we also have to, so as to not fetishize urbanization and make it divorced from its rural counterpart.
Right.
We also have to bring into the discussion Roberto Benedicto once again, because we have to ask, why are these informal settlers here in Manila and living this kind of life? And when we look at it, then we have to face the reality that during that time, rural poverty was was there. And people like Roberto Benedicto, the landlords, the hacenderos, they were the ones who were causing all this rural poverty because of their policies and how they ran their land holdings, forcing people to move into the cities, flock into the cities with so little opportunities for them. They had no choice. They had to build these makeshift houses and create these communities that were from the perspective of middle class people, squatter or di ba, slums. So may ano rin, there's also a rural dimension that we have to consider.
Thank you, Mike. I have a question for all our speakers. As a way of synthesizing what we've just done and discussed here in the panel. So it's something like this. It's really about student activism. We have student activism in the reverse form, just like what happened in the North. No, using students to continue, to reconstruct the myth of the Marcos legacy. But at the same time, there is another student activism being seen as anti-government. So given those particular situations, I'd like you to share with us your thoughts about the imagery, the portrayal of student activism nowadays, no? At this time of different platforms, different networking, different way of expressing themselves. What do you think? How do you define this type of student activism that we have right now? And you could, of course, can include the promises of it, the advantages of it, or disadvantages of it. So anyone can start with that. Would you like to start, Mike?
Or
yes.
I mean,
sige. Who's gonna share first?
Sequence lang.
Sige. All right, go ahead.
Ako naman nagsalita kanina. Ikaw na mauna.
Ako ba?
yes, Prof. Foliano, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, actually, I'm not a prof. I'm technically a student now. But,
okay.
Ano po? My sense is, and this is coming apart from the reading, no? But from personal experience then, with different student activists and leaders over the years. I do get this sense na there's no shortage of good intentions when it comes to student activism, youth activism. You don't go into this if you're not the kind of person who is, to a certain extent, optimistic about what can be done with regards to the situation. Naniniwala ka na meron kang pwedeng gawin. And the generation of students I've interacted with both before me, in my time, and even the ones I have taught over the previous years, kita naman natin na hindi naman nawawala yung level of optimism and hope na yon. The question, however, is, are we building environments wherein that kind of optimism and hope and potential for engagement is actually being fostered? No? This is why I mentioned in my discussion earlier, the kind of generational and community or environment a university fosters or a student is part of is pretty important. And for that matter, how does a student's family contribute to that conversation? Because if, for example, ang laging sasabihin ng magulang, ng pamilya ay huwag kang sasali sa ganyang klaseng gawain because you're gonna be imprisoned or you're gonna be socially ostracized, if not by your extended family, by your own parents as well. It causes additional tension and trauma into a person. Which is why a lot of people are sometimes given that choice. Either, they just shrink away from the opportunity from their willingness to engage because they don't want to displease their social network. And my sense is that kind of environment is also being exploited by those other conservative forces who are trying to tap into that activist potential anyway. Kaya nga hindi na rin naman bago na a lot of people who were activists in their student years, as documented by Mike and Ross, a lot of activists in their student years, eventually they end up into the kind of position and situation wherein they are the ones who are being oppressive. This government being a prime example of that. And I feel this is precisely because a lot of them either had a bad go of activism as well, which may not necessarily be because what they did was bad, but because, again, the network they were part of have not been able to keep them. So in this sense, I'm kind of putting a light on the accountability as well of movements and organizations to their members. Kasi more often than not, if the experience of activism for a person is bad, almost always they will fall away. And and also in a professional sense, I've seen this in labor organizing as well. A laborer who joins a union strike that loses and gets them fired from their job will never join it again.
Right.
So obviously, it's the responsibility of of any movement or any socio-political struggle in general. So yeah, masyado na pong mahaba. Maraming salamat.
Thank you very much. All right. Would you like to share now your thoughts, Mike or Attorney Dagade? Yes, Attorney.
Maybe I'll go last just to since mine is on a different tack, so it would be sort of a reaction to what Dr. Tante and Hansi would say. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, Mike.
Okay, I think I'm not in a position to compare the two. My study was not really in terms of studying the nature of student activism per se, but more of setting the stage to understand how activism developed in UP Diliman. I think Hansley is has more expertise in this line of research. Pero from me, this is not coming from an academic perspective, kasi this is just me trying to make sense of what's happening right now. There are certain continuities. I mean, many of the activist groups that we saw in the Marcos period are still there. Their basic ideological underpinnings are more or less intact. But we do need to look at certain differences that separate the current crop of student activists. Of course, we cannot avoid talking about the impact of social media. And many of our current activists now are looking at social media as an important location of not just propagandizing but also organizing future activists. Parang ano nga some people are saying, although it's quite exaggerated, but I get the logic in this claim that patay na raw yung generation of the GNDs o yung mga grim and determined, kasi yun yung typical depiction of activists during the Marcos period, GND, grim and determined, parang laging seryoso, laging nakasimangot, parang lahat gustong kalabanin. But in the age of social media, it's quite hard to attract people to your cause with such a grim and determined outlook in life in the age of TikTok and Instagram. And I think it's a positive sign, kasi activists are seeing na mayroon para magagawa with that, especially because we have to face the reality. Historical revisionism or historical distortions that favor the Marcos regime, they are having diba, the fiestas all around social media, YouTube, Facebook. So kailangan mong labanan din. But at the same time, kailangan rin bumalik sa roots, kasi social media is just one platform. Without solid grassroots backing, malalanta rin yan. I mean, gaano ba karaming mga Pilipino rin ang may access sa social media or internet for that matter. So may mga potential spaces for growth, but we should not also lose sight of continuities that define the activist generation of the Marcos years.
Thank you, Mike. And now we go to Attorney Dagade.
Actually, Ms. Presto is already on the Zoom call, and I think she would be more capable of addressing that comment. She will unmute herself and address the question. Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
Hello po sa lahat. Magandang araw po. Pasensya na po na late. Galing po ako
Presto.
sa unang engagement. Alright, so for the comment po on social media or on student activism right now, I can definitely say na it's still continuing. Despite what Attorney Togade may have already presented na specifically about Marcos focusing on youth programs. So an organization of UP students in a lot of UP campuses like Baguio, Diliman, Manila, still continue up to this day an ongoing discussion about the Marcos years. So a lot of organizations were formed in the height of the martial law. One of them was UP Namnama, the first and foremost Ilocano organization in UP, na up until now yung members still maintain a critical stance against the Marcoses. In fact, nung 2016 November, when the late dictator was interned at the Libingan ng mga Bayani, our members joined all of the protests. Tapos, they held up banners saying, hindi ko alam if pwede kong sabihin to, saying, blank Marcos in Ilocano. Tapos nag-viral sila and then they were vilified by a lot of Ilocanos also. But despite the fact na ang dami pa rin up until now, mga kabataan and not just Ilocanos na niniwala dito sa fabricated na Marcos is the most, as the greatest president in the history of the Philippines na kasinungalingan, at least we can still see some glimmers of hope in the continuing activism, not only of members of UP Namnamba, but of Ilocano students and their contemporaries in right now. So, ayun na po, maraming salamat. Pasensya na po ulit at na late.
Thank you, Ms. Presto. All right, so because we are running after time, so in terms of our wrapping up, so I'd like to go back to my notes as I was listening to you, and I would like to show you some of the comments not comments, but some thoughts. No, but I'll be presenting it in such a way that I'll be posting questions. No? So, in terms of what was shared by Dr. Pante, by Mr. Juliano, Atty. Tugade, and Ms. Presto, here are some of keywords. A while ago, I said something like the geography of student activism. So are we afraid to allow our students or the youth to touch the struggles of life, to have a direct touch of life in such a way? This is the real meaning of student activism. Do we allow them to be, quote unquote, contaminated with certain things in the society? As in reality, this is the manner of catalyzing change. Do we allow them to be distracted from their scholarly life in order to see the reality, to be awakened from their own serenity, from their own safety in the ivory tower? In terms of Mr. Juliano's sharing portrayal of student activism, are we trying to see this activism as a form of anti-government, or is it a manner of listening to the voice of the next generation as they do their own meaning making? So they are in the state of looking for their identity, and most of all, looking for identity is not only being an individual, but as a Filipino. Do we allow them to do that? And as presented by Atty. Tugade, in terms of their construction of the myth, or do we allow them to bust this myth, to come up with a new vision of what a leader should be? So nowadays, some teachers would actually lament the fact that, this is the millennials and the Gen Zs are so different. But at the same time, we should realize that activism calls for being ready, us, the adults, to ready the field, to plow the field for them so that they can grow with so much freedom, understanding, and critical thinking. Once again, I'd like to thank you, all the speakers. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, your ideas, your wisdom. And audience, thank you for sharing your time with us. And until then, till next webinars like this, we'll see you again. I'll turn you now over to Mr. Ramos, our moderator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pante. Thank you, Dr. Pante, Mr. Juliano, Atty. Tugade, and Ms. Presto for your informative presentations on intersections of EDSA and the contemporary issues on human rights and the youth as we commemorate EDSA at 35. And I would also like to thank Dr. Banasihan for your facilitation of our final panel this morning. So we hope everyone has gained important insights as you have watched the presentations from the panel presenters and engaged in the discussions in the parallel sessions. Okay. So as we close our morning session today, for some closing remarks, let us hear a message from Brother Armin Luistro, Board Chair of the Ateneo Martial Law Museum.
Isang mainit na pagbati sa lahat ng aking mga kaibigan sa bughaw ng mga pamantasang Ateneo sa buong bansa. I'm here at LaSalle Green Hills, and I remember distinctly 35 years ago what it was like fighting and joining our people at Edsa. I was then a young brother, and I have vivid memories of how proud I was of our people and what we stood for. We were together to fight against the evils of that time. That was part of the legacy that even today, as I watch what is happening in Myanmar, I remember very clearly how much I was proud of our people. What legacy has EDSA left with us? Sadly, I must say that there are many challenges and more questions that I face painfully 35 years hence. It is a part of our history that we should never ever forget. We must remember EDSA. I thank Ateneo de Manila for organizing this webinar, this gathering of nationalists, of people who love our country. And I hope and pray that together we will be able to stand the test of our own time, that we will continue to fight for democracy, and that we will continue to be a beacon of light and hope for our people during this very difficult time. Mabuhay po ang Ateneo at ang lahat ng aking mga kaibigan sa mga bughaw na pamantasan sa buong Pilipinas. Mula po sa mga Lasal Brothers at sa mga berdeng eskwelahan, mabuhay po kayong lahat.
Thank you, Brother Luistro, for those words. Join us later for our afternoon session, EDSA from the Eyes of Mindanao, part of EDSA at 35, Memories, Legacies, and Uncertainties, starting by 2 p.m. Philippine Standard Time. The link is provided in the chat box. So this ends our morning session for today's webinar, EDSA at 35, Memories, Legacies, Uncertainties. EDSA at 35 is a joint undertaking of the Departments of History of Ateneo de Davao University, Ateneo de Manila University, and Xavier University, the Department of Social Sciences of Ateneo de Naga University, Ateneo de Zamboanga University, and the Ateneo Martial Law Museum. To our participants here in Zoom from the different parts of the country, and I wish you all a good day, and in the different parts of the world, as well as our viewers in the live streaming on Facebook and on YouTube, have a pleasant day.